Então, muito boa tarde a todos. Sejam muito bem-vindos à segunda Conferência Científica da The Clinic of Change, sobre o lema Um ano de mudança e de progresso na saúde mental, psicoterapia assistida por ketamina. Passou pouco mais de um ano desde que iniciámos a nossa atividade no dia 12 de julho de 2023. Procurámos, desde o primeiro momento, criar um projeto com uma forte componente clínica, com suporte no que melhor se faz a nível internacional, promovendo o trabalho multidisciplinar e procurando contribuir ativamente para a construção de conhecimento científico no domínio da saúde mental. O programa desta conferência foi construído para continuarmos a atualizar-nos com a evolução do conhecimento no domínio da utilização de psicodélicos da saúde mental, com especial relevância para a ketamina ou cetamina, conforme preferamos chamar. O objetivo desta conferência está cumprido. Temos um painel de luxo, que está aqui e que se juntará em breve o professor António J. Santos. Temos uma casa quase cheia e muitas pessoas que nos estão a assistir em direto. Obrigado a todos pela vossa adesão e pelo interesse que manifestaram nesta nossa conferência. Agradecemos especialmente a todos os membros das diferentes entidades oficiais, dos nossos parceiros, entidades académicas, e também à PLMJ, que continua a ceder-nos o espaço para podermos ter este evento como gostaríamos. É um privilégio poder contar com o professor David Nutt e com a professora Célia Morgan e com o conhecimento que nos trazem um ano depois. São duas das maiores referências neste âmbito e estão permanentemente, como se costuma dizer, com a mão na massa, porque é relevante ter a mão na massa. Além de assistirem à sua intervenção, convido todos também a verem o livro, a versão portuguesa do livro do professor David Nutt, Psicodélicos, um guia completo sobre as substâncias revolucionárias que podem mudar a sua vida, que também está disponível, e também agradeço à Penguin por se ter associado a esta iniciativa. David and Celia, thank you so much for your presence in Lisbon today. We are very excited to continue to learn from you for your work and also for your thoughts of where we are and where are you moving to in this psychedelic world. O professor António Vaz Carneiro abrirá já de seguida o evento, procurando dar o mote de um ano de mudança neste domínio. Teremos depois dos nossos convidados especiais, do nosso diretor clínico, o professor Vítor Amorim Rodrigues, que apresentará a perspectiva do que foi a nossa atividade neste primeiro ano e os resultados, simultaneamente consistentes e principalmente muito encorajadores, que conseguimos atingir. Um obrigado a ele e, através dele, também um obrigado a toda a nossa equipa clínica. Seguir-se-á um pequeno debate com espaço para que possam colocar as vossas questões ao painel, a que se juntará o professor António J. Santos, que fará no final um pequeno resumo do evento. Temos a certeza de que todos daremos por bem entregues, ou por bem empregues, o nosso tempo nesta tarde. A saúde mental é, ou se calhar deveria ser, uma das prioridades da saúde no nosso país e todos os contributos são importantes para que haja uma resposta adequada, para que haja acesso, para que haja qualidade e para que haja novos resultados. Muito obrigado a todos e, sem mais demora, passo então a palavra ao professor António Vaz Carneiro para abrir cientificamente o nosso evento. O professor dispensa apresentações, é o pai da medicina ou saúde baseada na evidência e, entre muitas outras coisas, é professor catedrático jubilado da Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade de Lisboa e preside ao ISB, Instituto de Saúde Baseada na Evidência, que é um dos nossos parceiros científicos. Obrigado, professor.
I start by talking with our English friends. I will speak in Portuguese. I have to defend my language. So, thank you for being here. It's not the first time that we met, but thank you for being here. Doutor, também para si. Eu gostava, em primeiro lugar, de começar por agradecer o gentil convite que me fizeram para estar aqui hoje. E pedir desculpa, porque no fim da minha intervenção vou ter que sair, porque tenho uma videoconferência que é que não posso faltar daqui a meia hora. Porquê que eu estou aqui? Bem, para cá não sou psiquiatra. Portanto, sou aqui um corpo estranho. Não tenho qualquer ligação ao mundo dos psis, estou um corpo estranho aqui no meio de tudo isto, mas estou aqui porque sou presidente do Instituto de Saúde Baseado na Evidência, que é um instituto que resulta de uma parceria entre a Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade de Lisboa e a Faculdade de Farmácia da Universidade de Lisboa, com um conjunto de investigadores e de estruturas parceiras, incluindo redes de doentes, e que faz duas coisas. Fazemos investigação clínica e de base epidemiológica e fazemos formação avançada. Portanto, quando aqui há um ano e qualquer coisa nos foi proposto participarmos nesta viagem desta nova terapêutica para uma população de alto risco, como são os doentes deprimidos, resistentes ao tratamento, nós abraçámos imediatamente a ideia porque compreendemos que estávamos no início, ou pelo menos num caminho que já estava a ser percorrido, e que era muito interessante de seguir e de ver. É de facto uma área nova, esta dos psicodélicos, com um tratamento da doença mental e da dor crónica também, como sabem, não é? E até existe hoje em dia uma European College of Neuropsychopharmacology e Psychedelic Research Network, que tem 12 países que se dedicam, no fundo, a estudarem estas moléculas, estes fármacos, né, num conjunto de doenças, como, por exemplo, a depressão resistente ao tratamento, as adições, os síndromes de hiperatividade e déficit de atenção, as anorexias, os comportamentos obsessivos, etc. Portanto, há aqui uma área muito grande de intervenção deste novo grupo farmacológico, que ainda por cima sofre de obstáculos singulares, porque estas substâncias eram utilizadas noutros contextos e, portanto, há uma desconfiança estrutural sobre a sua utilização, como há de resto para o cannabis, para a dor crónica ou para as convulsões, ou como houve, a gente atravessou também esse caminho do cannabis. Portanto, e nesse sentido é de ser recomendado, quer os nossos convidados, quer a Clinic of Change, por terem perseverado na procura de soluções para estas doenças. Acontece também que a clínica abraçou o método científico e o que hoje lhes venho trazer no final desta nossa reunião é, no fundo, um estudo observacional de coorte, retrospectivo, em que nos vai dar uma ideia do que é que aconteceu no primeiro ano. E é isso que deve ser feito. Ou seja, por outras palavras, é este o caminho a seguir e não tanto achar que eu é que sei, portanto, isto vai funcionar ou não. Não, nós temos que documentar cuidadosamente, de uma maneira muito, muito rigorosa, o que é que se está a passar. Até porque na doença mental é muito mais complexo do que nas outras doenças e, portanto, é fundamental compreender a realidade de uma maneira particularmente detalhada. Acontece ainda por cima que a psiquiatria, como sabem, espero resistir ao vosso ataque antes de sair desta sala, tem como evidência científica muito fraca. Eu lamento dizer isto, mas há um número muito pequeno de estudos de alta qualidade na psiquiatria. Se formos comparar com a cardiologia ou a oncologia ou as quaisquer, os nossos amigos psiquiatras têm um longo caminho a percorrer. E eu reconheço que o modelo psiquiátrico é completamente diferente do modelo cardiológico. É muito mais fácil o cardiológico, como é óbvio. No entanto, não há desculpas para isso. É difícil para o profissional que trata de doentes, que está envolvido na saúde mental, arranjar e selecionar informação de alta qualidade. Não é nada fácil fazer isso. Muitos dos estudos que são publicados têm pouca relevância. E a pouca relevância que têm não dá para os aplicar para a prática, são amostras muito pequenas, muito selecionadas e, portanto, a pessoa não consegue ir ali buscar a informação que é fundamental. O que quer dizer que muita da prática não tem qualquer base de evidência. Dizer isto em 2024 é complicado. É complicado, na medida em que temos neste momento qualquer coisa como 60 milhões de artigos e nas 4 bases mais importantes de bibliografia médica. Portanto, deve haver aqui algumas pistas para explorar, não é? Acontece também que os próprios ensaios clínicos têm, de facto, características muito próprias. A medição do outcome é uma delas. Eu, no colesterol, meço o colesterol é igual em toda a gente, meço o colesterol em 15 mil pessoas, dou uma pílula a metade delas, vejo se o colesterol baixa. Agora, como é que eu meço verdadeiramente, mesmo com as escalas, os sintomas de depressão? Nós reconhecemos isso, e reconhecemos que isto é uma área muito difícil, muito complexa. É por isso que esta abordagem não experimental, embora a experimental seja muito importante para garantir, no fundo, que o que estamos a assistir é de facto induzido pelo aquilo que estamos a intervir, é óbvio que neste caso, e é isto hoje que vamos também apresentar, as chamadas real world evidence, a evidência da vida real, passa a ser muito importante. Não só com, digamos, registros doentes, mas, por exemplo, com este género de estudos que vão ver aqui. E é muito interessante porque eu até há pouco tempo, nas minhas revistas de medicina, via muito poucos estudos que tenham a ver direto ou indiretamente com a saúde mental. Às vezes acontecia, mas é muito raro. Todos aqueles que a gente leu, o New England, o Annals, o BMJ, o Lancet, essas coisas todas. E, curiosamente, pela primeira vez em muitos anos, este ano saiu no BMJ uma revisão sistemática em rede de base bayesiana, que estudou, que eles pesquisaram 4 bases de dados, identificaram 15 ensaios clínicos de psicodélicos com um total de 811 doentes, adultos, e depois olharam também para selecionar também 4 estudos com o citalopram como para comparação indireta. Como sabem, há comparações de direta para a comparação indireta através dos outcomes. E o primeiro outcome foi a mudança dos sintomas de depressão, através de uma escala, que é o que é habitual, e aquilo que se concluiu é que a psilocibina foi aquela que melhores resultados teve. Sendo, no entanto, importante que a MDMA, o LSD, a ayahuasca e talvez outros sejam relativamente eficazes. A diferença é que não é muito grande. Está ali qualquer coisa, mas não podemos dizer que seja um impacto extraordinário. Curiosamente, nestes estudos, o efeito placebo é muito pequeno. Sabem que há muita gente que acha que o efeito placebo de um psiquiatra é poderosíssimo. E, portanto, eu para dizer que uma medicação entra, tenho que tirar o efeito placebo do psiquiatra. Que há em alguns estudos que seja calculado que metade do efeito é por causa do psiquiatra. A pessoa vai ao psiquiatra, gosta, fala, e isso só por si resolve uma quantidade. O que é muito interessante. Como é que a gente tira isto? Não é fácil. De qualquer maneira, esta é a demonstração que, de facto, esta é uma nova área de investigação pujante, que nós esperamos que venha a ter muito sucesso. Agora vou terminar apenas mostrando já assim a ketamina, porque, para mim, todos estes compostos são relativamente iguais, que eu não faço. Repito, não os utilizo. E a ketamina, imaginem só, teve 2 estudos major no New England Journal of Medicine este ano. Eu nem queria acreditar. Quando fui ler, fui da segunda vez, a ver se estou a ler bem, ou se é a mesma revista que eu costumo receber. É inédito. É extraordinário. Garanto-vos, é extraordinário. Há muito tempo que não vejo no New England 2 estudos no mesmo ano sobre o mesmo tópico com metodologias diferentes. O primeiro foi publicado logo no início, em que compararam a utilização de ketamina, são sempre os doentes deprimidos que não respondem ao tratamento. Portanto, por definição, uma população de alto risco, e é preciso perceber o que é isto que estamos a falar, é uma população de alto risco. Eles compararam a ketamina com a terapia eletroconvulsivante. Ok? A amostra foram 365 doentes e a resposta, que foi a redução dos sintomas, verificou-se em 55 versus 41 doentes, quando se comparava a ketamina com a terapia eletroconvulsivante. Okay? Durante os 6 meses seguintes, portanto, o relapse, a recaída, foi 35% no grupo da ketamina e 56% no grupo dos choques. Portanto, temos aqui uma peça de evidência que me parece muitíssimo importante para nós percebermos como é que deveremos ou não colocar esta nova e contextualizar esta nova abordagem. Isto são os estudos que nós precisamos. Olha, isto são os estudos que Vossas Excelências precisam. É este género de estudos. Não são opiniões de experts, vem para aqui dizer o que lhes vem à cabeça. Não. São estes género de dados que são cruciais. Porque uma coisa boa nunca vem só, acontece que houve também aquilo que é crucial na produção de evidência, que é a comparação entre 2 fármacos. E também no New England Journal of Medicine, repito, eu fiquei espantado com isto, mas enfim, é de facto o New England Journal of Medicine, o que quer dizer que é um selo de qualidade e de importância que urge não diminuir, não menosprezar. Apareceu de facto um ensaio clínico de 32 semanas, open label, portanto sabia-se o que é que estavam a tomar, e enfim, tem os seus problemas, em 676 doentes com depressão resistente a terapêutica, ok? Isto foi um estudo add-on, portanto, juntaram-se estes medicamentos àquilo que os doentes já estavam a fazer, e a comparação foi com a quietepina, ok? XR de libertação lenta. E o que aconteceu é que a remissão foi superior nos doentes a fazerem ketamina, 49%, versus a fazer quietepina, 33%. E, em termos da segurança, a descontinuação de tratamento por efeitos adversos foi em 11% no caso da quietepina e 4% no caso da ketamina. Portanto, aqui tem alguns exemplos do que é que nós, leigos nesta área, precisamos, mas também Vossas Excelências precisam, para poderem depois, em primeiro lugar, perceber se a realidade está lá, se aquilo é verdade. E num mundo em que o efeito placebo é tão grande, isto é um problema sério, ter a certeza absoluta que as moléculas que estão a ser, os fármacos que estão a ser estudados, de facto, aquele efeito é real, é um efeito real. Estamos sempre preocupados com isso, com todas as especialidades, pediatria, cardiologia. Aqui é ainda mais importante, reconhecendo também que os resultados podem ser mais complicados de interpretar, precisamente pela sua natureza. Isto não quer dizer que os psiquiatras não devam fazer bons estudos, e é essa a minha mensagem final, porque nós precisamos muito de tratamento de uma das áreas mais importantes à face da Terra da medicina, que é a saúde mental. Não há nenhum estudo, enfim, global sobre prevalências de doenças que não venha nos 3 ou 4 primeiros lugares a nível mundial a doença mental. Portanto, não deve haver aqui questões e não deve haver aqui muitas hesitações em pôr esta área como uma das áreas prioritárias para os serviços de saúde, sejam eles quais forem. E era basicamente isto que eu queria dizer. Era uma visão de um leigo na matéria, mas que é capaz de olhar para os formatos e dizer isto devia ser feito assim, mas precisava da vossa ajuda. Eu sou daqueles que acho que um urologista deve saber ler um ensaio de cardiologia. Tem que perguntar ao cardiologista o que é importante na doença coronária, por exemplo, e depois interpretar o que lê. Eu defendo isso. Não há nada estranho, nem nada disto é muito difícil. Nada disto que eu estou a falar é muito difícil. E, portanto, quanto mais a gente se compenetrar que essas novas intervenções têm o seu caminho para andar, e o caminho muitas vezes é um caminho muito complicado, nomeadamente quando não há previamente já algum conhecimento científico, quando é sempre mais fácil, é mais fácil eu introduzir no mercado uma heparina ou uma insulina, porque tenho não sei quantas antes. É muito mais fácil eu introduzir no mercado um antidiabético oral, porque tenho não sei quantos antes. Portanto, o quadro e a área do conhecimento está muito bem definida, sabe-se muito bem o que é importante ou não é importante, o que é que se deve estudar ou não se deve estudar, e é a partir desses princípios metodológicos que depois se fazem os estudos, que depois têm consequências imediatas para o regulador. O regulador, para ele, é fundamental perceber, eu vou pagar isto ou não vou pagar isto. E se pagar, tem que dizer porquê, e se não pagar, tem que dizer porquê. E, portanto, espero sinceramente, felicito a Clinic of Change sobre estas iniciativas, agradeço a vossa paciência para me ouvir e dizer-vos que para o Instituto esta é uma área que nós gostaríamos de continuar a estar ligados. Antevemos grandes e complexos momentos para esta terapêutica. Isto é, isto não vai ser linear, mas acho que vale muito a pena, acima de tudo porque os pobres dos doentes não têm alternativa, por amor de Deus. Às vezes a gente está a falar em não pagar coisas que têm 15 medicamentos que podem fazer o mesmo. Este caso não é. Portanto, eu que não sou psiquiatra fico muito impressionado com estes doentes, que são doentes de facto, enfim, repito, de alto risco e que merecem toda a nossa tentativa de os melhorar. E era isso basicamente que eu vos queria dizer. Uma vez mais, muito obrigado pela vossa presença e a paciência de maturarem. Muito obrigado.
Muito bem, muito obrigado, professor António Vaz Carneiro. Vamos então dar continuidade ao nosso programa. And now it's now time to give the words to our first keynote speaker, Professor David Nutt, that will talk about ketamine versus classic psychedelics. David Nutt is well known, but is the Chief Research Officer of the Awaken Life Sciences, and is Professor of Neuropsychopharmacology of the Imperial College in London. So, Professor David Nutt, you can come on stage.
Thank you. Let's get rid of that horrible image. Well, it's really nice to be asked back. And I suppose there are two reasons you asked me back. The first one was to celebrate the fact you've been running for a year. And that's really quite an achievement. And secondly, you kindly had my book on psychedelics translated into Portuguese. And there are some copies outside for those of you who want to have two copies, the English and the Portuguese. And I will sign them both. But it's also rather nice to be here today with the other speakers, because previously we haven't been a team. And that puts me in a really lovely position, because I'm just a warm-up act. They're going to give you the substance. They're going to tell you about the advances, the scientific advances, particularly in relation to ketamine. And I'm going to just introduce some concepts relating to psychedelics and hopefully sort of set a bit of an ambition for the future, which, if you carry on being successful, then the clinical change will be part of over many years. So what's happened in the last year that we can celebrate? Well, the most interesting thing that happened to me was that I was invited to talk about psychedelics at the Vatican. And that was a rather unexpected invite. I thought it was a joke. I followed up with the email to Professor Wolf Singer, who's a professor of neurophysiology in Germany. He said, no, it's a serious thing. They have a scientific academy at the Vatican. And that goes back a long way, he said. You'll be standing in the footsteps of other scientists. And I said, well, like who? And he said, well, Galileo, of course. And I said, well, hang on. That didn't end so well, did it, really? But I thought, well, I've got to go, and I went, and it was a very interesting experience. It's a rather spectacular conference venue. That's just the conference venue. That's not the real chapel. That's not Michelangelo's chapel. That's just the conference venue. But I wanted to go particularly because I was the only psychiatrist on the conference. I was the only person talking about psychedelics, and obviously because the Vatican has enormous reach. If we could get the Catholic Church supporting the use of psychedelics for human good, then I think my job would be close to being done. So I went, but I also wanted, when I was there, I wanted to talk to them about the fact that psychedelics have a long relationship with religion. So rather than presenting to them these drugs as some kind of novel innovation to be feared, I wanted them to understand that they've been part of the whole generation of religious beliefs for many thousands of years. And what is kind of particularly sort of apposite for the Vatican is, of course, that the basilica that is in the Vatican, or what the Vatican is behind, is St. Peter's Basilica. So there he is, there's St. Peter. The Vatican is, as you know, it's a little country that sits behind the basilica there, and the conference venue is on the top of the hill. And there's St. Peter overlooking the basilica. Now, St. Peter has a particularly important role for those of you who, well, you probably all know this, but some of my students don't know this. Some students don't know that St. Peter is the man that lets you through the gates of heaven. And of course, it's quite a challenging set of gates to get through. This is the medieval view, which is you were stripped naked so that any blemishes could be seen. You wouldn't be smuggling drugs in, would you? And if you were good, you'd get through the gates of heaven. So St. Peter was the gatekeeper. What's that got to do with psychedelics? Well, psychedelics have been around in many cultures. And if you look at the top left-hand image there, you see two cacti that make a psychedelic called mescaline. One's a peyote cactus, and the other cactus had a different name. It had a different name until the Spanish got to South America and started talking with the indigenous people who were using both mescaline and also ayahuasca, the top right-hand image, for religious purposes or for experiential purposes. And as you probably know, the Spanish, and I feel confident saying it in this group of people because you're not the best friends with the Spanish, are you? So it wasn't you weren't trying to eliminate this use in the Amazon, but they were trying to eliminate it in the other countries, the countries they took over. And they tried to get rid of the use of psychedelics on the grounds that it was heathen and wouldn't allow people to properly relate to God. And they started telling, well, I don't know if this is true, but this is my interpretation of what happened. They started explaining to the indigenous people if they believed in God and Jesus, and they were very good, they would enter heaven through the gates that St. Peter opened for them. And my guess is the native people said this, but we have another way of entering the gates of heaven. It's this cactus. And we're going to call it San Pedro, St. Peter's cactus, because it does what St. Peter does. So that's why San Pedro cactus is named San Pedro cactus, because mescaline will give you a similar kind of experience. Well, we don't know. No one can test that theory. But anyway, at the very least, there's a possibility that psychedelics can open up the gates of your mind, so you believe you're going to heaven, even if you don't actually get there. Now, there are other psychedelics as well on this slide. If you go across, you see magic mushrooms, 200 species of magic mushrooms all around the world. And that's probably the earliest representation of a psychedelic experience. The mushroom man from Algeria. It's kind of inconceivable that anyone would draw a man like that who hadn't taken mushrooms. There's ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is one of the great inventions in psychopharmacology, a cocktail of two plants, one which contains DMT, dimethyltryptamine, and one which contains a substance called harmaline, which is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. If you drink DMT, it won't have any effect because your liver and your gut will break it down too fast. But the indigenous people had worked out that that cocktail was a bioactive concoction, because it had a substance which prevented the breakdown of DMT. And of course, there's the classic visions of ayahuasca are visions of serpents and jaguars, you can see from that top right image. And that was the other reason the Spanish wanted to eliminate the indigenous religion, because in that religion, the serpent was the good guy. The serpent actually connected you to heaven, whereas, of course, in Christianity, the serpent's the bad guy that actually corrupts humans. You keep going clockwise, you go to the bottom right, use the Amanita muscaris, a sort of rather weedy psychedelic, which was used in Europe. It's a different psychedelic, it's a GABAergic psychedelic, it's the active ingredient's muscimol, I won't talk much more about that. Come across to the middle, you see Hinduism. Hinduism emerged from a cocktail which was called soma. Now, we don't know what soma was, but various experts over the years have tried to work it out, and the best guess is that soma is a cocktail of cannabis, THC, magic mushrooms, and the stimulant ephedra. And it would be nice for someone to recreate that, because I presume that kind of cocktail would be rather powerful. It might explain the multi-arms and limbs that many of the Hindu gods have. And then the bottom left-hand side, you see some images from ancient Greek, Hellenic Greece. And they show the Greek god Demeter, who was the god of agriculture, partaking of a drink called the kykeon. And the kykeon is a drink which is a combination of wine and ergot. Ergot is a fungus which grows on cereals. And the Greeks had worked out that when the dew hit the cereal crops in September, October, the fungus would grow. They thought it was the culmination of the cereal. That was what the cereal was about. They took off the black bits, dissolved it in wine, and had a very powerful hallucinogenic drink called the kykeon. And they used that drink to celebrate the mysteries, the Eleusinian mysteries, which ran for about 1,500 years, both before and after the Romans occupied Greece. And those mysteries were celebrations of dance and theatre and poetry that underpinned Greek social life and probably made a contribution to the other great advances that the Greeks made in terms of architecture and logic and geometry, and also, of course, democracy. And there is very little doubt that Western society is built on Hellenic principles. So, you can make the case maybe the psychedelics had a major underpinning role in our culture as well as other cultures. And if we fast forward to the modern era, which really started with the rediscovery that lysergic acid, one of the ingredients in the kykeon, could actually be converted into something even more potent called LSD by Albert Hofmann. And in the 1950s, the company Sandoz that he worked for made LSD available for a range of purposes, largely because at that time there were no treatments in psychiatry other than sedatives and opiates. and there were no tools to explore the brain or the mind. And LSD was the first true, I was going to say weapon, but it's not really a weapon, the first tool we really had as scientists to study the human mind. And LSD was used for a variety of purposes. It was used to model psychosis. It was used to help people in the mental health professions get an experience of altered consciousness which would help them. It was thought to be more in tune, more empathetic with their patients. And it was used in therapy. And there were two kinds of therapy: psychedelic psychotherapy, which is mostly what we do today, give someone a big dose of something, psilocybin or ketamine, out of which they come changed. But there was also psycholytic psychotherapy, which was a slightly more cautious form of therapy, which was preferred by us cautious Brits. And we gave a low dose, a non-hallucinogenic dose, before every psychotherapy session to try to break down what's known as resistance. I just want to share with you how those early directions of LSD research have kind of carried on today, or been resurrected today. So the psychomimetic properties of drugs like psilocybin can be used to model psychosis. And I've been working with Professor Mittal at King's College, taking healthy people and giving them a trip, a psilocybin trip, and then seeing whether you can stop the psychotic-like experiences with other drugs that wouldn't normally be expected to stop psychosis. And one of them is a strange drug that none of you would have heard of probably, called saracatinib. It's a kinase inhibitor developed for cancer. Turns out it attenuates some of the effects of psilocybin in healthy volunteers. And that's now gone into trials of psychosis in Parkinson's disease. Because in Parkinson's disease, you don't want to use classic antipsychotic drugs because they block dopamine receptors. And people with Parkinson's disease have a deficiency of dopamine receptors. So this is an example of how we might begin to use psychedelics to develop new forms of therapy. Mental health professionals are not allowed to use these drugs, so that aspect of self-insight has not really developed subsequently. But psychedelic psychotherapy is widely being used. Currently, when we're using psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, we use a 25 milligram dose. That's a very standard dose. It produces a fairly reliable, powerful trip. And we're also beginning now to resurrect lower doses of psycholytic psychotherapy. And the reason we've started doing that is because some of our patients said that they were definitely not interested in having a trip. They were actually scared of having a trip. And this started with patients with OCD. We explained to them that actually they might be able to break free from their obsessive thoughts or compulsive behaviors if they had a trip. And they said, yeah, but you don't understand, doctor. They don't understand. You know, the whole point of OCD is not to lose control. So we accepted that. And obviously you can't force people to do things they don't want to do. So we settled on a lower dose, a 10 milligram dose of psilocybin, given as part of a program to try to encourage them to engage more in activities which would break down the obsessive behaviors. And that study was actually really surprisingly effective. And we're also now using an even lower dose in people, young people who self-harm, to try to encourage them to think differently, to facilitate the ability to think differently rather than to reach for the razor to cut themselves. Now, as I said at the beginning, psychedelics boomed in the 1950s because there was nothing else. These were a true revolution. And they were used by the top psychiatrists at the time. They were used across the US and Europe. And the results were published in the top journals, and the results were overwhelmingly positive. Not only were these drugs effective in helping people with psychiatric disorders, they also had very low rates of suicide and very low rates of psychotic-type reactions. And those data, in a way, have stood the test of time, because modern data suggests that those data were correct. And so we're in a very interesting position now. We have drugs like LSD and psilocybin, which we know we have a bigger database of safety than probably any other psychiatric drug when it was started in humans. And that's been quite helpful in persuading countries like Australia to actually allow the use of psilocybin as a therapy. And this is just a quote from an expert who reviewed the literature. Treatment with LSD is not without acute adverse reactions. Trips can be challenging. For people with psychiatric problems, they usually are challenging. But given adequate psychiatric supervision, that means doing it in a controlled setting with trained therapists, and proper conditions for its administration, the incidence of such reactions is not great. And if you want, you can read, there's quite a detailed review. It's freely available on the Drug Science website of that historic literature and the modern literature supporting the safety of these treatments. But the war on drugs, which emerged as a consequence of the Vietnam War, led to the catastrophic collapse of investment in psychedelic research in the end of the 1960s. That top left-hand graph you see, it shows the blue line is the number of papers published each year for LSD, and the pink line underneath it, the number of papers published each year with psilocybin. And there were massive increase from the early 1950s to the late 1960s because of the huge investment by particularly the US government in this work, but other governments too. And then the arrow shows when the international ban came in and the cataclysmic fall-off of research. And that was done deliberately. Government stopped funding this research, and they also made it very difficult for people to get access to the drugs. There was a deliberate attempt to eliminate all knowledge of these drugs because they were seen as too dangerous. And the reason they were seen as dangerous is because they were changing the way people thought about war. And the anti-Vietnam War movement was strongly associated with the peace movement, and the peace movement was using LSD to change people's minds. And that image, the bottom right image, was very, very terrifying to the American government at the time, and probably to many other governments in the world. Drop acid, not bombs. And the decision was made to ban these drugs to stop encouraging anti-war protests. Of course, the war ended, but the ban has not ended, and it's still present in every country in the world. And that's one of the reasons why ketamine is so vital, because at least we have a medicine we can use to produce similar effects therapeutically to these psychedelics. They didn't just ban these drugs for recreational use, they banned them for medical use, and they banned them on 3 lies. They said they had no medical value, even though papers were being published up to the day of the ban showing they were medically useful. They said they were very dangerous, and I've shown you the data that they weren't. And they were said to be addictive, when the evidence was overwhelmingly that they were anti-addictive. And this is the worst censorship of research in the history of the world, and it's something we should continue to protest against, because it still persists today. And one of the ways we've been fighting back is by challenging these lies that these drugs are harmful. And expert groups in the UK, the bottom left, in the European Union, the top right, and in Australia, the bottom right, have all done detailed assessments of a range of drugs that are used recreationally. They've used a technique called multi-criteria decision analysis. It's the most systematic way of assessing drug harms. And they all come to the same conclusion. That even when used recreationally, psychedelics are amongst the least harmful of drugs that are used recreationally. And we can be confident that when they're used clinically, those harms will be even less. And that, again, was a factor in why the Australian government decided to reduce the scheduling so that psilocybin and MDMA could be used. So I just want to spend a little bit of time now going into the pharmacology of these drugs and to contrast them with ketamine to some extent, but also to show you where there are significant overlaps. So the drugs I've been talking about, mescaline, DMT, psilocybin, LSD, they're all serotonergic agonists. They all bind to the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, and the affinity determines clinical dose with a prediction which is very remarkable in neurobiology. The receptor, the top right-hand side, the receptor is cloned. We know it's a G protein link receptor. We know where on the protein structure the psychedelics bind. We know that the binding site is mimicked by the binding site for serotonin down on the bottom right. And we know that blockers of that receptor, blockers which we use commonly, drugs like risperidone or mirtazapine or olanzapine, prevent the effects of psychedelics. So we're very confident that the 2A receptor is the target of these drugs. Now, we've known that for about 40 years. What's become very interesting in the last decade is our understanding about why there should be 2A receptors in the human brain. And these two images of the brain talk to that question. So the left-hand image is a heat map of the 2A receptors, and it shows the high density of the 2A receptors in areas in the frontal cortical regions and the posterior cingulate cortex. Very low density in areas of the midbrain and brainstem, and that's why these drugs are very safe. They don't interfere with fundamental processes, particularly respiration. They're also safe because they don't mess around, particularly with your sensory motor strip, and they don't actually change your visual system at its primary level. But where they really work is in these areas of the brain, which we now call the transmodal cortex. And the transmodal cortex is the most recently evolved parts of the human brain. It's the part of your brain that makes you human. It's the one part of our brain which is different from other primates. It's the massive expansion of the human brain that has occurred in just the last few million years. So the bit of the brain which does all the human things, like thinking and feeling and planning and anticipating and analyzing, is loaded with 2A receptors. And that's really unexpected. We don't know why that is. We've written a paper recently suggesting maybe these receptors help pattern the way in which the human brain works, why the very high-level functioning of human cortex could be potentially patterned by having a high density of these receptors. We're not sure. But what we can say categorically is that psychedelics work on the most high-level parts of your brain. That's a fact. What do they do? Well, serotonergic psychedelics bind to the 2A receptor, and that's over here. The 2A receptor is on these glutamate terminals, and it stimulates the activity to release glutamate. And on the left-hand side, you see two other psychedelic drugs. You see ketamine and scopolamine. And they work to indirectly activate glutamatergic neurons. So rather than directly stimulate them, they take off a tonic inhibition. They take off a brake which is always sitting on those glutamatergic neurons. Either way, you get a great surge of activity, a massive firing of neurons. And the neurons that fire are the neurons which connect the brain. They connect across that huge chunk, 50% of the brain, this recently evolved part of the brain, the human brain. By disrupting the neurons that connect across that brain, you change the way in which the brain works. And that's why a psychedelic experience is very different from any other experience, because the brain is working in a very different way. Now, we know this from imaging studies with fMRI and also from EEG, and also from MEG. This is a MEG. This is a rather elegant series of studies comparing drugs, psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, and ketamine, with drugs such as benzodiazepines, anesthetics, alcohol, and glutamate antagonists. Very, very different profile. The color coding is important. Blue means reduced power in all the frequency bands. Down here, you have the classic frequency of EEG frequency bands from low frequency to high frequency. Blue means less power in those bands, and red means more power in the bands. And if you get more power in these bands, for instance, in these bands, you get massive increase in power, the brain is very synchronized, and you're anesthetized. You don't do a lot of thinking when you're anesthetized. So sedative drugs synchronize the brain. Psychedelic drugs desynchronize the brain. And that desynchronization is sometimes called the entropic brain. It's a state of very different function, out of which come different ways of thinking. And that's central to the fact that people can escape from conditions like depression and addiction as a result of that kind of trip. This image now has become a kind of meme for what psilocybin and other psychedelics do in the brain. And it's really important to help us understand why the change in connectivity in the brain is critical to the clinical experience. So those two images both contain the same number of connections, 7,200 connections. The connections are defined by which parts of the brain, which little measures of the brain, little cubes we have in the brain, the voxels of the brain, change in activity in relation to another one changing. So it's a correlation coefficient across the brain. On the left-hand side, you'll see that's the normal brain. It's called the small world brain. And it's an explanation as to why your brain is 10 times more efficient at information transfer than the best computers humans have come up with. 10 times better than the best we can do electronically. And that's because your brain is extremely efficient at interrogating data, and it does it at a very local level. So typically, your visual cortex talks to itself, your auditory cortex talks to itself. Of course, if you hear a bus bearing down on you, you've got to move your legs to get out of the way, so there's got to be some crosstalk. But the enormous size of the human brain and the energy costs of communicating across this vast network of neurons has meant that the brain has become very efficient at doing things very locally. And that's great. That's really great, because those of you who understood every word I've said, you've understood it because you understood every word I said. It's not even your native language. But understanding things like language is so deeply ingrained that it's impossible for you not to understand it. And that's great. That's really, the efficiency of the brain is explained by the small worldness. But suppose you ingrain a wrong thought. Suppose you're traumatized as a child. Suppose you're told by your abuser that it's your fault. And if you tell anyone, he'll kill your mother. That thought will become deeply ingrained. It'll be thought through multiple times a day over multiple decades. And de-ingraining deep thoughts like that is almost impossible through any process other than disrupting the networks in which they're encoded. And that's what psychedelics do. Here you see the psychedelic experience is putting the brain back to a state where all connections were possible. That's the state your brain was in when you were a child. And one of the theories of education is to take a brain where everything's possible and force it to be like a brain where everything's predictable. That's what we call education. And sometimes it works, but it can leave legacies. I just wanted to show you this rather beautiful image. This is the first image of the connectivity of the brain under LSD, showing massive hyperconnectivity between the visual cortex, which is this little blob at the back here. This is the small world brain. This is the LSD brain. Huge increase in connectivity, which, again, contributes to the insights that people have under psychedelics. So I've explained to you there are mechanisms underpinning the psychedelic experience, mechanisms relating to these pyramidal cells, which are depolarized, leading to the entropic brain, leading to hyperconnectivity. But there's one other mechanism which is on here, and that's neuroplasticity. And this is our understanding of this has come as a process of back translation. Animal researchers have asked the question, what happens after you give a trip to a rat or a mouse? Do these changes persist? And they discovered that there are some interesting alterations in brain function after either a psychedelic trip or a ketamine trip. And that's the growth of more dendrites, those little bits that stick out of neurons, and the synapses which make the connections between neurons. And that process of neuroplasticity, we believe, is quite important in allowing people to continue to benefit from the experiences they have during the trip. Because it seems like this period of neuroplasticity can last for several weeks, and it allows people then to develop new schemas of thought, new ways of dealing with problems, etc. And there's one particular impact of psychedelics in terms of network disruption, and that's on a network called the default mode network. How many of you have heard of the default mode network? Well, not all of you. So in 1 minute, I'll explain what it is to you. So the default mode network is the network at the top here. It's a network which is the front and anterior posterior cingulate, these lateral regions here. It's a network in which you do your thinking about yourself. So we're going to activate your default mode network now. So I want you all to close your eyes. And when I stop speaking, I want you to reflect a bit on whether so far it's been worth coming to this conference. Okay, open your eyes. Now, if I was scanning you then, this would be the dominant network. It's called the default mode network. It's because it's what's active when you're not moving your arms, you're not listening, you're not looking at things. It's where you do this introspection, this reflection, planning, etc. Remarkably, psychedelics completely disrupt that. Now that explains some of the features of the psychedelic state. It explains why people don't know where they are. They often say they're floating out the scanner, they've gone to another dimension, they might have gone to heaven. And that's because the default node network is also involved in encoding your place in space and time. But it's central to your sense of self. And strangely, about the same time as we published these first data on disrupting the default mode with psilocybin, this group in Yale had published a paper suggesting that the default mode network is over-connected in depression. Here you see the amount of the brain that's connected in that self-referential thinking in healthy controls, and here people with major depressive disorder. Depressed people have a lot more of their brain doing this introspective thinking. Of course, that makes perfect sense, as that's what depression is. It's a disorder in which people are ruminating about mistakes, past failures, guilt, etc. And that overconnectivity explains a lot, because it also explains why depressed people struggle with executive tasks, because if you're using such a large chunk of your brain thinking about the past and guilt, etc., you've got less capacity to think about the present and to add up things and read books, etc. So we thought, wow, the over-connected default mode in depression, we can disrupt the default mode. Maybe psilocybin will disrupt depression. So we set up a trial, and the trial was very successful. I'm not going to go into the methodology in great detail, but in essence, there are 3 phases, and you'll probably hear more about this in the next 2 talks. A preparation phase when people are educated how to get the benefit out of the trip phase in which they explore where their mind takes them, where the drug takes them, and then a phase afterwards where they engage in psychotherapeutic processes to try to maximize the benefit from the trip. So it's a kind of 3-day process for each trip. And these are the outcomes. So this was a group of 20 patients, treatment-resistant depression. They'd all failed on 2 antidepressants. Some had failed on over 10. They'd all failed on CBT. And they all got better to some extent. Some got dramatically better. Some are still well 15 years later. That single trip of psilocybin produced the most powerful outcomes in resistant depression there's ever been. And that's actually encouraged a lot of companies to be set up to try to go into this space to develop medicines which can be licensed for this indication. And several studies have been published since. I won't go through the 3 of them at the top. Those are 3 psilocybin studies. The top right-hand one is the most impressive one because that's a multi-center, 7 different countries, multiple languages, showing that a single 25 milligram dose, the same dose as we gave, got a quarter of patients in remission at 3 months. Again, treatment-resistant patients. But also I want to point out at the bottom graph, there are studies that have been done in Spain and also in Brazil using ayahuasca. It seems like any psychedelic that produces a powerful trip will have this potential to be used as an antidepressant and probably as an anti-addictive agent as well. And here are many other studies that have used psychedelics to try to deal with anxiety at the end of life, to deal with smoking, quitting, alcoholism, etc. We've got studies coming to be written up now in anorexia and OCD and in pain syndromes. And you might say, well, this doesn't make any sense at all. You know, you've gone from depression, which we understand as that disorder of feeling low and feeling guilty, to all these other different disorders. How can that be true, and how can it work? And the current thinking about this is that these are all what we call internalizing disorders. They're all disorders in which people get locked into thought processes that they might know are wrong. I mean, people with OCD, they know they don't have to wash their hands 30 times to get rid of germs. They know that. They just can't stop doing it. Many addicts know they don't even enjoy taking the drugs anymore, but they can't stop themselves. And psychedelics seem to have the power to disrupt those internalizing thought and behavioral processes. And we know that the magnitude of the experience has some predictive value. So this is not just being given a drug, it's being given a drug that actually, the more it does, the more you experience the subjective changes. At least with psychedelics, the greater the output, the better the response. You can see that the responders in blue tended to have greater experiences of unity, of blissfulness, of spiritual experience, and insightfulness, whereas the other more hallucinogenic type experiences didn't distinguish between those who did well and those who didn't do so well. So it seems as if getting an understanding that you can change is quite critical. And then finally, I just want to touch on the last point. You might say, well, this is all very well, but we got pretty good treatments of depression, haven't we? You know, I mean, maybe all psychedelics do is they just do it a bit faster. And we didn't think that was likely, so we set up a study where we compared psilocybin, 2 doses of psilocybin, 3 weeks apart, with escitalopram, the standard SSRI for depression, given for 6 weeks. Both groups got psilocybin, but the escitalopram group got a low dose, a 1 milligram dose, a non-active dose. The psilocybin group got a 25 milligram dose. But they all got exactly the same preparation. They all got the same therapy through the sessions, etc. So we, as far as possible, balanced out the psychotherapeutic experience. So we could just then look at the impact of the 2 drugs. And we found that the psilocybin was somewhat better than escitalopram in terms of reducing depressive symptoms here, considerably better than escitalopram in improving well-being, definitely better in getting people into remission, between 2 or 4 times more likely to get into remission, depending on the scale. So it was a powerful evidence that it's at least as good, if not better, than escitalopram. And on most measures, the 2 psilocybin doses significantly outperformed the escitalopram. And from that, we essentially they thought this was good support for the theory. We wrote this paper in 2017. And in this paper, we argued there could be 2 ways to lift depression. The traditional way is through an SSRI or some other antidepressant, uptake-blocking antidepressant, that enhances serotonin in the limbic system. That enhanced serotonin works through a 5-HT1A receptor, that's an inhibitory receptor, and so you dampen down the stress center of the brain, the limbic system, the amygdala, and that reduces anxiety as well as depression. Whereas ketamine and psilocybin work in the cortex, a completely different part of the brain. They work through a different receptor setup, the 5-HT2A and glutamate receptors. They break down this rigid perseverative thinking you have in disorders like depression. They increase cognitive flexibility. So there are 2 ways of lifting depression, we argue. Now, I just want to give you the analogy of what antidepressants do, because I think this is quite a powerful one. Antidepressants are to the brain what plaster of Paris is to a broken bone. The plaster doesn't heal the bone. The plaster allows the bone to heal because it takes the stress of movement out from the bone, from the fracture. That's what antidepressants do. They protect the limbic system from stress in depression. The limbic system is reactive to stress. They protect it from stress the limbic system heals. That's why antidepressants take 4 to 12 weeks to work. Psychedelics work almost immediately because they disrupt the thinking processes which underpin depression. And we're in a really exciting time now, because for the first time ever, we have 2 ways of lifting depression. Now, in most major disorders, and depression is a major disorder, it's certainly as important as disorders like cancer or cardiovascular disease, we have multiple treatments. If one fails, there's another one with a different mechanism of action. And this is the first time our patients have the option of a different treatment. And I just want to give you this quote from one of our patients who's been through both treatments. He said this: "Where escitalopram nulled me to be less scared, the dampening down of the stress system, psilocybin has made me realize that fear is not something to be feared." So a cognitive reframing of how you deal with stress. And quite remarkably, in those 2 studies we've done with psilocybin in depression, the brain imaging data has fitted or correlated extremely well with the experiences of our patients. I'm going to show you those experiences in a second. But the imaging data showed that there's reduced modularity. The brain becomes more flexible. It's more able to switch between different states following psilocybin. And escitalopram doesn't change that ability. And in fact, the more flexible the brain becomes after psilocybin, the better the outcome. And you can see here that as the brain becomes more flexible, networks like the executive network become more functional, which explains why people can do things like go back to work. And this accords remarkably with what our patients tell us. They very often use computer analogies. It was like when you defragged the hard drive on your computer. I visualized it was all put into order. And I thought my brain is being defragged. How brilliant is that? We'll also talk about having run a viral scan, running just reformatting the hard disk. And that getting out of the rigid ways of thinking allows them to change the way they deal with the world. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as if I've seen a much clearer picture. And there's also this intriguing phenomenon of better connections to the self. Here's one patient. "I had an experience of tenderness towards myself, a feeling of true compassion I'd never felt before." This is a weird phenomenon, but many people who have been traumatized blame themselves. We don't entirely know why they do that, but it's a common issue that it perhaps makes sense of why they've been traumatized at all. And psychedelics seem to have that ability to allow you to not be the cause of your own problems. And this is just this is my fun one. It's like ingesting your own psychotherapist, but a lot cheaper. So I'm going to finish by just giving you this way I like to think about what's going on in the brain and the mind of our patients. In depression and addiction, the energy landscape of the brain is very, very extreme. You have deep troughs. Depression is called depression because you're in a depression. Your mood is deeply down. And I like to use the analogy of Switzerland. This is like Switzerland. You can be in a valley here, and you can speak French, and you may not know that in the next valley they speak German, because you haven't got the energy to get over that pass and see. You can't get out of the thinking loops. During the psychedelic experience, you get the flattening of the energy landscape. I showed you that. We do not scan our patients during the trip, because that could be very counter-therapeutic. But we know this happens in healthy volunteers, flattening of the energy landscape. When we scan our patients after the trip, the landscape is flatter. It's easier for them to get out. When they start thinking a negative thought, they can switch out of it. When they start craving that bottle, they can come up with another way of dealing with that urge. And it's, I think, quite exciting that we can see that our treatments have actually changed the minds of our patients. And this is a wonderful quote from the playwright George Bernard Shaw: "Those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything." And I think what our psychedelic research is telling us is that we psychedelics can change the minds of our patients through changing their brains. And the big challenge now is changing the minds of regulators and the minds of payers and the minds of politicians. I think the public are convinced, and certainly patients are. And I've already intimated this, but Australia has changed. Australia is the first country in the world to reschedule psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression on the grounds of safety and efficacy. And their regulators say, well, we don't need to wait for an American drug company to tell us how to do medicine. We'll make our own decision. And there are 77 patients now in Australia who have gone through this scheme. So I'll stop now. Am I taking questions now? We're doing questions at the end. At the end, and I'll get off. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Professor David Nutt. So, and you'll take time to our second keynote speaker, Professor Celia Morgan. We will talk about ketamine-assisted therapy, a review of evidence and current practice. Celia Morgan is Professor of Psychopharmacology at the University of Exeter and the Principal Investigator of the Exeter Translational Addiction Partnership, ETAP, and the Ketamine for Reduction of Alcoholic Relapse Care programs. Celia, welcome on stage.
Thank you, and thanks, Dave, for that fascinating talk. As Paolo said, I'm going to talk about ketamine-assisted therapy, a review of evidence and current practice. It's really exciting to be here. It's a year and a bit since I came last time when the clinic was opening, and it's been really amazing to see the data coming out of the Clinic of Change. So I wanted to thank them for inviting me and letting me bring my dad along as well. It's the first time my father has seen me speak. I think he thinks I'm a physiotherapist, so he's going to be quite shocked. But yeah, so I'm going to give you a kind of overview, just to kind of set up for Victor, really, of ketamine-assisted therapy and what's going on at the moment. So obviously, Dave gave us some insight into what ketamine is. I thought to further give us some information, we turned to a really credible source. Sorry, it's probably too soon for this. And this is depressing in a way that ketamine can't really treat. But the context for this, Trump, when he was in last, said he was going to get a lot of ketamine for veterans when ketamine became licensed for depression in 2019. And someone asked him, what is ketamine? And he said, I guess it's a form of stimulant where if somebody is really in trouble, it can do something. I guess that's the searing intellect, which means that he's been re-elected today. So sorry to remind people of that. Actually, contrary to what Trump said, the World Health Organization, but who are they anyway? Maybe you can shut them down. Have said that ketamine is actually for the sedation. I don't know if my microphone's working. For the sedation of both children and adults, perhaps the most widely used agent in the world. So not a stimulant, but actually a sedative, anesthetic. And it's been on the essential medicines list since 1985. So ketamine was actually first synthesized as an anesthetic. It's not a naturally occurring compound, like a lot of the psychedelics Dave was talking about, although it has been found in a worm, so it's thought, or in a fungus, and it's thought to fight off a worm, actually, so that's been found after it's been synthesized, which is interesting. But yeah, so it's synthesized back in the 60s as an anesthetic replacement to PCP, and initially people were really impressed with it as an analgesic anesthetic, but then it was noticed people were coming round from ketamine anesthesia, reporting quite a range of strange side effects, out-of-body experiences, disorientation, that meant that its use has been somewhat limited in mainstream anesthesia, but it's still really important in veterinary anesthesia, for instance, which is why it's often given the nickname horse tranquilizer. I don't know why it's specifically horses, but it could be cat tranquilizer. Also really widely used in chronic pain in quite low doses, in pediatrics and older adult medicine, and also in field medicine and in developing countries. And that's primarily because it's got a really good safety profile compared to other anesthetics. It doesn't slow your heart rate or your breathing. So if you aren't able to maintain someone's airway, it's a really good anesthetic to use. Along with its properties in anesthesia, as Dave has already mentioned, ketamine has emerged relatively recently, so I guess in the past 20 odd years, as a rapid-acting antidepressant. And this is kind of the landmark study, Carlos Zarate study. There was a study previous to this by Robert Berman in 2006. And you can see here, this is depressive symptoms on the y-axis and time across here, that following a dose of ketamine, there's a placebo with the black dots, ketamine the white dots, we see this reduction of depressive symptoms almost immediately following the ketamine administration. And these are in people with treatment-resistant depression. And this peaks 24 hours following the ketamine administration, and then the symptoms return over a period of about a week. And this finding of ketamine having a rapid antidepressant effect that wears off over about 7 days has been replicated in a number of studies, and you can see from this meta-analysis here, this is ketamine and its effects on depressive symptoms at 24 hours. So the dot being over this side means that it favors ketamine, this favors control. And then at 3 to 4 days, the dot's kind of moving towards the center, so the effects are tapering off across all of these studies. And by 7 days, the effects nearly diminished. And so in all of these studies, it's giving ketamine alone as a standalone medication, not daily like SSRIs. So this is why ketamine has been hailed as one of the biggest advances in psychiatry in the past 50 years, as Dave mentioned, because there really haven't been any new treatments. But yes, it's not taken daily, but it's taken a couple of times or repeatedly. These effects then disappear over time. So this is giving ketamine in a very medical model as a standalone treatment. So it's not to say that this doesn't have its place, and actually for people with treatment-resistant depression, this is a really brilliant alternative to things like ECT, and ketamine alone can be really efficacious. But ketamine-assisted therapy, I would argue, is different, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. And in my mind, that it's more effective. And there's a number of reasons for that, and I think mainly it's because with the therapy, we're able to kind of harness these unique properties of the drug on many levels that really can prolong and enhance the therapeutic effects. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. So Dave has already covered this a little bit. So one thing that ketamine-assisted therapy can harness are these neuroplastic changes that happen in the brain. And so this is a really nice review by Lily Alexandrova in Trends in Pharmacological Sciences. And this shows how, as a kind of convergent mechanism of classic psychedelics and ketamine, and how they both have these downstream effects on neuroplasticity and structural plasticity in the brain. So here, ketamine's blocking NMDA receptors, because ketamine's an NMDA receptor on these GABAergic interneurons presynaptically, and this has a kind of disinhibiting effect on these glutamatergic neurons that produces an increase in glutamate, and then these downstream changes in things like mTOR and BDNF that produce structural plasticity changes in the brain. And this is the kind of classic study from science. So in this paper, at baseline, you can see these are the spines actually on the dendrites in the brain, and then through stress treatment, so court treatment over a period, these spines are removed, and that's kind of a model of what happens in psychiatric illness in humans, so that we know that we get kind of reductions in dendritic spines following chronic stress. But just 24 hours following ketamine, we can see the spines are starting to regrow. And with that, the potential to make new synapses. And so one way that ketamine-assisted therapy can work synergistically with these changes in the brain is by targeting the therapy during this window of neuroplasticity. And that's what some of the emerging treatments have used this model and worked upon this. So this is Sam Wilkinson's work, and he's at Yale in the US. And so in this study, Sam gave ketamine treatment over 3 weeks, so 6 doses of ketamine over 3 weeks in people, and then looked to see if they had a clinical response or not. If they didn't have a clinical response, they were withdrawn, but if they did, then they were able to be randomized to have CBT twice a week for 2 weeks, and then weekly for the next 12 weeks. Or they continued into a treatment as usual group. And what we see here in his study, so they're not overwhelming findings, because this is the MADRS, the Montgomery-Ashburg Depression Rating Scale. There were no differences. Oops, the star seems to have moved. There are no differences between the groups. So this is the bit where they have ketamine, and you can see here the depressive symptoms are dropping off in both groups. But then on the MADRS, there's no difference. But actually on this QIDS, the quick inventory of depressive symptoms that Dave was just talking about with the psilocybin findings, we see so there's the reduction in depression here following these 6 doses of ketamine at 3 weeks. And then in the group given CBT, we see a sustained antidepressant response. Even looks like depressive symptoms are getting lower still over this extended treatment with CBT. Whereas in the treatment as usual group, depressive symptoms are returning to normal. So the model here is really, and how Sam explains it in the paper in a way, is to target CBT following, so the ketamine kind of opens up this window of neuroplasticity and then target the CBT in that period. Similarly, Becca Price, who's at University of Pittsburgh, has been doing some interesting work with just a single dose of ketamine and looking at doing some kind of cognitive training. So this is an automated self-association training. So here in this study, people were given a single dose of ketamine, and then they either had active automated self-association training, I'll tell you what that is in a minute, a sham, or saline. And so this automated self-association training comes from the social psychology field, and it's basically, these are people with depression, based on the fact, as Dave was mentioning, you get a lot of negative self-referential thinking in depression. So this really relies on classical conditioning and kind of trains people to associate positive things with their name and their identity. So it's both verbal and visual. So in this case, the person Dominic, so the name will flash up and people have to respond, and then a happy face comes after Dominic, and that can be pleasant words and pleasant things. And so what Becca did in this study was give the dose of ketamine, and then twice a day for 4 days, people did this training. So in the active group, they associated positive things with their own identity. In the sham group, so they were still doing the training, but they were just associating neutral things. And we do, well, it's not a huge difference. You can see here in the group given the active training, we see a significant difference in depressive symptoms a month following just a single dose of ketamine. And again, this is the kind of rationale for this is targeting within this window of neuroplasticity. So they give the ketamine experience and then do the training, that the brain's somehow more neuroplastic. So, that's all well and good, and it's really nice to see this kind of translation from, so as Dave mentioned, this work about neuroplasticity came from observing that ketamine had these antidepressant effects, and then loads of preclinical work uncovered this mechanism and the time course of it, and that's great. But it seems, that there is maybe more to ketamine than just this neuroplasticity. And what happens to the brain when people are on it, these really unusual experiences that people have. So to kind of illustrate that, sorry, I'm going to look down here to read this out. So this is an experience of someone having ketamine as a treatment for alcohol problems. So this is Eli Kolb's work. It's got a high dose ketamine. And this person says, first my mind was pulled out of my body and was thrown into a void. Then my mind started dissolving into the void, and soon nothing was left except my soul. I continued alone, existing in an infinite but empty black space. I realized I had died, and immediately my entire alcoholic life started flashing before me. I relived all the dismay of my life as a drunkard and remorsefully witnessing waking up in my own puke, suffering from repeated hangovers, continually hurting my body, stupidly destroying my precious mind. So it seems quite a lot to unpack there that might be more useful therapeutically than maybe just a kind of a purely neuroplastic explanation. I really like these reports, so I put another one in, these case studies. So this person said, my body dissolved and I became a tiny bubble of living energy floating away into the darkness of the land of the dead. I collided with another bubble that was very gloomy and recognized my dead stepfather. I became conscious how tormented his soul was, and for the first time I was able to forgive him abusing me. Instantaneously I moved from the darkness into the luminous white light and became one with God. I felt profound peace and became filled with unconditional love. This experience seemed to last an eternity, and for the first time in many years I became joyful and hopeful again. So it's really dramatic, and not all the experiences are like this, as some of the therapists will realize, or as, there's kind of obvious the psychotherapeutic benefit of this, which goes beyond maybe just thinking of a purely reductionist explanation. in terms of neuroplasticity. So yeah, to talk, and obviously Dave's touched on this, but when we think about these experiences and the subjective experiences that people have, they're really unusual. So people will experience awe. By that mean a kind of huge experience that requires, kind of necessitates a change in your self-schema, really to be able to accommodate it. And that's often associated with a sense of emotional breakthrough, which is kind of described in some of those reports. And we also, hear people reporting mystical experiences. Again, as Dave was talking about, and particularly, Williams James defined these 4 aspects of mystical experience, but particularly this noetic quality. And that happens a lot with ketamine. People report that they're experiencing some sort of fundamental truth about the nature of reality. And this has been shown actually in studies to predict therapeutic change in people with cocaine use disorder, for instance. And my colleague, Peter Susted Hughes, and others, who's a philosopher, have looked at metaphysical changes following psychedelics. So that psychedelics change people's, and ketamine as well, change people's understanding and beliefs about the fundamental nature of reality. And that can have huge and dramatic impacts. So it seems like this phenomenology is important. The subjective experience of the drugs is really important. And that's something that can be harnessed therapeutically. And there's a long tradition of people doing this. So some of the really earliest work with the ketamine was as an abreactive agent. So that is the notion that you can elicit kind of traumatic memories. And this was a group in South Iran in the 1970s, giving ketamine to patients of a variety of different diagnoses, and found very profound effects. And so the idea that the ketamine was being given so people explored traumatic memories that might be difficult for them to access. And they seem to have good effects. I mean, I thought this particular quote was kind of interesting. So they gave really high dose ketamine and low dose ketamine and had much better effects with the high dose ketamine. But with the high dose, they said it should be noted that all patients had a loss of contact ranging from 25 seconds to 4 minutes, in which they had the typical schizoanesthetic appearance, a peculiar look described as an absent-minded individual detached from the present and fixed on infinity. I thought this idea of being fixed on infinity seems quite kind of resonates with the mystical qualities of ketamine. And then in the 80s and 90s, Evgeny Krupitsky, who's a psychiatrist who was working out of St. Petersburg, he took this work forward really by giving ketamine in what he termed ketamine psychedelic therapy. So he was working with people who were inpatients with alcohol problems and people with heroin addiction, and found some quite dramatic effects of giving ketamine in a container that really made them, it was really designed to exploit the psychedelic experience. So this was the psychedelic therapy that Evgeny delivered, where participants would have 10 hours of psychotherapy as preparation. It's worth saying that actually Evgeny started out using ketamine as a kind of counter-conditioning agent, so he was trying to aversively condition people by giving them ketamine and then trying to associate negative experiences under the influence, so to stop people drinking. But he found actually the transcendent positive psychedelic effects of the drug seemed to be more transformative on people's recovery. So then he switched to this psychedelic model. But yeah, so in this, you have 10 hours of psychotherapy as preparation. And during this, there's a lot of expectations set up about the nature of the experience. So sorry if that's, I know it's quite big up there. So in these therapeutic sessions, the subjects it was explained, so this was with heroin, that the relief of their dependence from heroin will be attempted in an altered state of consciousness. And then they were told that it would help them realize the negative effects of heroin and think about the positive aspects of their life without drugs, and that it might give them insights about their personal problems, might modify their system of values and their notions of self and the world around them, and help them to discover a new purpose in life. So a lot of different expectations set up there in these preparation sessions. And we know people are quite responsive to suggestion under psychedelics and drugs like ketamine. So that's probably an important part of this therapeutic process. And then they would have the session where they were supported with this heroin treatment. It was only one session. With alcohol, they gave 3 sessions. And then they had 5 hours of psychotherapy afterwards. This is in the heroin example. to interpret and integrate these experiences into everyday life. So it's a very different model to the ones I was talking about with the training given in the neuroplasticity window or giving CBT post-ketamine. And here, the experience is very, very central to the therapeutic process. And Evgeny found quite remarkable results. So in people with alcohol use disorder, so this is 12 months, and these were inpatients in Russia, he found, we know about 75% of people normally will be back drinking after 12 months, but this was reduced by 40%, so only just over, so just under 30%. So quite dramatic reductions in return to drinking in this very treatment-resistant group. And similarly with heroin, so he actually followed people over 2 years. It was high-dose heroin, just at one single dose. So he gave as a control a low-dose ketamine of 0.2 milligrams per kilogram, and found these significant differences between the high-dose and low-dose groups still evident at 2 years following the ketamine administration. So yeah, some really exciting early findings. Unfortunately for Evgeny, then concerns about the misuse of ketamine meant that the drug was scheduled and in Russia completely banned, so it was unable to continue this work. But yeah, and we've been able to pick it up. So I'll talk about that in a minute. And yeah, just to touch on, Dave mentioned these different kind of models of therapy, and as a result of some of Evgeny's work, people like for Wilson in the US has done quite a lot of work, and this is a paper reporting, it's real-world evidence, but with 235 patients giving ketamine-assisted therapy. And here they use a model of using a psychedelic dose or using a low psycholytic dose. So here in this kind of trance state, with a much lower dose of ketamine. So here they give it sublingually in this, and then 25 to 400 milligrams sublingually, which has a much slower onset than having an intravenous dose of ketamine or intramuscular. And they say this is useful, the psycholytic experience, because it promotes communication, access to difficult states of mind, less fear from those encounters. So this is something we hear quite a lot psychologically about psychedelics, that they reduce experiential avoidance, so the tendency to move away from distressing emotions. And I think this is what is being described here with ketamine. And yeah, that this enables people to have a kind of conscious awareness, communicate with people, but with this engagement with more negative, distressing information, and then integrate the sense of feeling. So they find this psycholytic state to be really useful, and there's other groups doing work with that at the moment. Dave has sort of already covered this, really, but this is to say there's these kind of 3 models then, which hopefully I've given you a little flavour of ketamine-assisted therapy. And this comes from David Matai's paper. This diagram, which is quite simple, but we can see the psychedelic here, so the therapy is the lines. Here, the lines are before and after the experience. This kind of dotted line is that people are left alone there. So it's a kind of model of bookending the psychedelic experience. And here, it's a big circle because it's a big experience. With the psycholytic therapy, the therapy continues throughout the experience because the experience is much smaller, the doses are lower, and people are able to be responsive and work through things during that process. And here we have our kind of plasticity-orientated model, which is to have the experience as just completely separate to the therapy. So yeah, there are these 3 different potential models, but what we wanted to do with our work is to try and kind of harness the power of all of them. There's no reason really why you can't combine them all. And so that's what we've been aiming to do. So to harness both what we've learned from neuroscience, but also what we understand from the phenomenology, to get the kind of maximum therapeutic effect. And we've adapted an evidence-based therapy for ketamine. And so we adapted mindfulness-based relapse prevention. And I think I presented this when I was here last time, but we've done some work looking at how ketamine it promotes engagement with mindfulness practice, and almost seems like a sort of experiential stepping stone to mindfulness. And we've also shown that ketamine helps with the process of decentering, so that's the kind of knowing that you're not your thoughts and kind of disidentifying with that, which is also useful and is kind of integrative with mindfulness practice. So we think they're a good fit together. And we've developed this therapy, which we, oops, that's the wrong button, which we call CARE, which is kind of to make ketamine and alcohol sound a bit more friendly. And yeah, so how our therapy works is we do kind of bookend the ketamine experience in a kind of psychedelic therapy type way. So people have a session, then they have the ketamine infusion, and then they come back the next day and have another follow-up session of therapy. But they come back 24 hours later, so they're kind of, this is what we would know from neuroscience is the peak neuroplastic period. So where hopefully people are able to learn more readily. And people have the ketamine infusion, we kind of leave them alone for that experience. But when people are recovering, we do a mindfulness practice now and engage people in dialogue. So it's not really psycholytic therapy, but I feel like there's a kind of a marriage of a psychedelic therapy approach and the neuroplasticity based approaches to ketamine therapy. So yeah, this kind of bookending of the ketamine infusion happens for 3 weeks, and then people have a final session on week 4, and that's the kind of fundamentals of our therapy. I think Vitor is going to talk about the results a little bit with that. But so I ran a clinical trial of this in severe alcohol use disorder. It was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2022. This was the kind of model of this trial. We had 96 patients. So people were randomized to 4 groups. So we had ketamine and therapy, ketamine and a control for therapy, which was education, placebo and therapy, and then placebo and education. So we wanted to look to see if there was a kind of combined effect of the ketamine and the therapy, and to try and control for positive effects of just spending time in a room with a therapist, which we know can be beneficial, and therapists are really nice people, generally. So this was our 4 groups. So people were randomized in the study, randomized to one of these groups, and they went through the treatment process. And then we followed them up at 3 and 6 months. And these were the main findings, really. So this is during the treatment period. There's very little difference between these groups. But at 3 months, we're starting to see the groups diverge, and this divergence is greater still at 6 months, where we see the greatest number of days abstinent from alcohol in people given ketamine and therapy, then ketamine and education, then placebo and therapy, and placebo and education. So this was one of our primary outcomes. We had another one which was purely relapse. So if anyone had had a single heavy drinking day over 6 months. And that didn't show significant differences, but we did find significant differences on this primary outcome. So that was exciting. And we also found other kind of positive effects of the ketamine treatment, which you might expect. So at the end of the study, people in the ketamine group, probably because they're drinking less, had better liver function than the placebo group. We also found, we did some qualitative studies, and we found a lot of kind of reported effects. And similar to what Dave was saying, one of the key things that emerged was that people reported greater feelings of connectedness, which we found surprising. Ketamine is from a class of substances called dissociative anesthetics. Perhaps it's not surprising. But yeah, these are some patient reports. The sense of oneness that I felt and the sense of moving away and focusing on the worries and the small stuff was helpful in improving my relationship with alcohol. And so essentially it was showing that we're all connected, that there's this connection between all beings, things, to bring us out of this kind of prison of addiction and put the problems in perspective. So nice to hear this kind of reports of greater connection emerging. And a lot of people have kind of conceptualized addiction as a disorder of connection. We also found in some of our secondary outcomes, so things like depression and anxiety were lower at 3 months, and anhedonia. So that seems to be a more prolonged effect than you get when you give ketamine as an antidepressant on its own. So we're still seeing reductions in depressive symptoms at 3 months. So we took these findings, applied for a grant with some funding also provided from Awaken Life Sciences, and we're now running this, which is imaginatively called More Care for severe alcohol use disorder. So we've made some kind of changes to the study. It's essentially the same setup as the care therapy, but we have a kind of we have a peer support group following the 6-month outcomes. So something the patients from the first trial said was that they really wanted to talk to people who'd had experiences like this. So ketamine produces, and psychedelics produce this kind of ontological shock. So people, often this is such an unusual experience, and when they go back to their lives, they've got no one who can really understand what that's like. So that's why we've set up these peer support groups, which are optional, and outside of the primary outcomes of the trial. We're also following people up to 12 months, as many as we can while the study's ongoing. and we're doing some more qualitative interviews. So excited about that. We're running at 8. We've opened 7 of the 8 sites now. It's Imperial that we haven't opened, Dave, so I need to count them, across the UK. And we're hoping to have the results. That's going to be 280 patients and with severe alcohol use disorder. We've only got 2 groups in this, and it's high and low dose ketamine with psychological support. But yeah, we hope to have some results by December 2025. So maybe I can come back to Portugal and present them then. That would be nice. Yeah, so we're really excited about that. So yeah, just to conclude, really, ketamine has these unique properties, but not just neuroplasticity, others that can be harnessed to make psychotherapy more effective. And although the biological model has dominated in ketamine, the ketamine literature and giving ketamine as a treatment on its own, this really produces quite short-term effects that actually we found if we give ketamine alongside psychological therapy and psychotherapy, we can produce these sustained therapeutic changes. So yeah, the future for our care approach is, or this and care and CAP in general, is that is great. So this kind of clinical practice is gaining ground in the US and Canada, and we're seeing increasing real-world evidence reports of ketamine-assisted therapy. We hope that the evidence from our phase 3 trial will enable the rollout of this treatment in the UK and the NHS, and maybe the EU. And meanwhile, we're able to deliver this state-of-the-art evidence-backed psychotherapy with key partner clinics until we're able to roll it out more widely. And one of those is obviously the Clinic of Change here. So yeah, thanks. I know we're having questions now, but thanks everyone. Now I'll hand it over.
So, thank you so much, Cecília. Vamos agora passar para português e vamos dar a palavra ao professor Dr. Vítor Amorim Rodrigues, que nos falará sobre a evidência clínica do primeiro ano da Clinic of Change. Vítor Amorim Rodrigues é psiquiatra, professor de Psicopatologia e Psicoterapia no ISPA, Instituto Universitário, ex-presidente da Federação Portuguesa de Psicoterapia e, com muito orgulho nosso, diretor clínico da Clinic of Change. Vítor.
Olá a todos, vou falar em português, mas só umas palavras aqui. Thank you so much for having learned so much with you, Professor David and Professor Cecília. And I'm going to speak in Portuguese, but you can follow with the slides, will be in English, so that you can follow. Bem, então está na altura de mostrarmos ao fim de um ano de trabalho os nossos resultados preliminares. Atenção, são números preliminares, serão depois publicados, ainda precisam de ser trabalhados e serão publicados. Foram muito trabalhados, sobretudo, e acho que é justo fazer esta homenagem pela professora Suzete Costa, que é uma investigadora do Instituto baseado na evidência e que fez este trabalho. Também grande parte deste trabalho que eu vou apresentar é dela, no sentido de ter trabalhado os dados e ter preparado estes slides. Antes de começarmos propriamente, não posso deixar também de partilhar o meu orgulho e a minha satisfação por este nosso trabalho, por esta caminhada, e eu tenho de facto muita honra de ter sido, enfim, um líder desta equipa de excelência que tem, e como iremos ver, temos, enfim, números, como eu digo, preliminares, mas que estão a par com os números de grandes centros de excelência internacionais e, portanto, é de facto um grande orgulho, sendo que o mérito não é meu, o mérito é da equipa, e é também do facto de nós apresentarmos um programa e trabalharmos com um programa que já está validado do ponto de vista empírico e que é um programa, de facto, que aprendemos com a Awaken, como iremos ver, e, portanto, de certo modo, nunca vendemos, entre aspas, gato por lebre, isto é, aquilo que nós apresentamos são, de facto, coisas que estão baseadas na evidência e que têm uma fundamentação científica sólida e não propriamente, enfim, embarcar em experimentalismos ou coisas que pudessem depois, enfim, de alguma maneira, levar ao engano as pessoas que nos procuram. Um ano, portanto, aqui da nossa psicoterapia assistida por ketamina. Enfim, alguns dos slides são apenas para digamos, de alguma maneira localizarmos um pouco a importância deste problema. Todos nós já estamos a par destes números, milhões de pessoas, isto são números da OCDE, com perturbações mentais que estão a aumentar, sobretudo há uma maior consciência depois do confinamento e do Covid, e de facto nós portugueses temos aqui uma percentagem, uma prevalência alta de perturbações mentais em geral, uma das maiores da Europa, em primeiro lugar com as nossas perturbações de ansiedade, depois logo a seguir as perturbações depressivas, as perturbações por uso de álcool e de substâncias. Portanto, temos aqui todo um conjunto de perturbações que algumas delas são resistentes às terapêuticas standard e por isso é que fazem sentido este tipo de tratamentos. Entre os quais a psicoterapia assistida por ketamina. A ketamina, como o nome diz, enfim, os que tiveram bioquímica já há muito tempo, eventualmente, nos cursos, sabem que as aminas, de um modo geral, têm um núcleo de nitrogênio e depois têm radicais hidrogenados, que depois acabam por ser substituídos aqui, neste caso, por outros radicais, e por isso é que se trata de uma amina, está dentro do grupo das aminas, e esta é a cara, digamos assim, da representação gráfica da nossa ketamina, que tem dois geniantómetros, não é? O R e o S, e que são como uma espécie de, enfim, como as nossas mãos, não é? Têm uma simetria semelhante às nossas mãos. Não se sobrepõem, mas são simétricas. Sabemos também que a ketamina foi usada, enfim, tudo isto são coisas já muito conhecidas. Nós utilizamos uma mistura racémica, portanto, uma mistura das duas ketaminas. Como sabem, há também a possibilidade de utilizar a esketamina, portanto, a S-ketamina a nível nasal, mas o nosso programa é um programa em que temos uma mistura racémica destas duas enantómetros da ketamina. Foi aprovada já há muito tempo, é conhecido como anestésica, analgésico, isto leva até muitas pessoas a ficarem um pouco duvidosas, ketamina, então, mas isso não é um anestésico, algumas pessoas até dizem um anestésico de cavalos, um anestésico de animais, enfim, há esta ideia, mas de facto é importante dizer que as nossas doses são doses subanestésicas, não tem nada a ver com as doses que se usam na anestesia, porque senão também não seria possível qualquer tipo de psicoterapia. Estamos a falar de doses muito mais baixas que vão ter então os tais efeitos que nos interessam trabalhar. É muito segura, isto é outra coisa muito importante, sabemos que nas doses muito altas que são utilizadas na anestesia é muito segura, de tal maneira segura que foi até utilizada, por exemplo, em cenários de guerra, e era utilizada até por pessoas que não tinham preparação, portanto soldados que administravam uns aos outros, porque de facto havia uma grande segurança em termos de pessoas que ficavam feridas, não é? Ferimentos de guerra, usada também na pediatria. Mas percebeu-se que, de facto, tem aqui um efeito antidepressivo muito potente, que já foi, aliás, referido pelos oradores que me antecederam. Não vou, enfim, isto também já foi trabalhado, não vou estar aqui a deter-me nos efeitos, propriamente nos efeitos bioquímicos da ketamina, só dizer que, de facto, enfim, o mais conhecido e o mais importante é de facto de bloquear o receptor NMDA do glutamato, portanto uma via diferente, embora, como tínhamos visto, acaba também por influenciar de uma maneira indireta os receptores da serotonina, não é? Da 5-hidroxitriptamina, mas de facto aqui é por uma via diferente e talvez isso explique em parte o facto da ketamina ter efeito em situações resistentes aos antidepressivos convencionais, que a maior parte deles acabam por ser bloqueadores da recaptação da serotonina e alguns da serotonina e da noradrenalina. E é essa via diferente, esse efeito diferente que explica o seu efeito antidepressivo muito potente e que acaba então por ter efeito nessas depressões resistentes, mas também outros efeitos, como o efeito dissociativo e efeitos psicadélicos propriamente ditos, isto é, de alterações do estado da consciência, que para algumas abordagens deste tipo de terapia são coisas a evitar, evitar, e para nós não são coisas a evitar, são coisas, pelo contrário, a querer e a trabalhar, na medida em que isso vai permitir o trabalho psicoterapêutico. Penso que com a professora Cília ficou claro que, por exemplo, estados de natureza mística e outros disfunção egóica, têm melhor prognóstico, e são estes, precisamente, que estes e outros, que têm relacionados com o passado, relacionados com as próprias relações das pessoas, que é muito importante, não é? Estamos cada vez mais, percebemos que a psicoterapia, os aspectos relacionais são fundamentais, e são esses efeitos que é possível trabalhar do ponto de vista psicoterapêutico. Portanto, não são efeitos secundários para nós, são efeitos importantes, e percebemos que, a professora Cília também já o demonstrou, que a utilização de psicoterapia assistida por ketamina vai ter melhores resultados do que a ketamina isolada ou apenas com abordagens psicoeducativas. Uma breve história, apenas com alguns pontos principais. Evidentemente não vou estar aqui, porque isto seria só uma hora para falar um bocadinho da história da utilização dos psicodélicos, mas enfim, um longo caminho, já foi aqui também dito pelo professor David Nutt, as culturas tradicionais que utilizavam desde há muitos séculos, milénios mesmo, estas substâncias, mas enfim, a nossa história mais recente, que enfim, acabámos por começar aqui com a descoberta, ou com a síntese pelo Albert Hofmann do LSD, e tendo-se percebido logo do seu potencial efeito terapêutico, e enfim, todos os principais pontos, com a nossa modestíssima contribuição, dos 48 pacientes de que vos irei falar aqui na nossa Clinic of Change, 48 pacientes seguidos durante este ano. Bom, quais são as nossas principais indicações? Reparem que nós estamos numa situação de pessoas que, e eu realço sempre isto, muito até em entrevistas, de pessoas que passaram pelos meios tradicionais, pelos métodos tradicionais, standard, e que são resistentes a esses métodos. É esta a nossa população primordial, é para aquela que nós dirigimos de facto, a nossa atenção. Não é? E estamos a falar, então, de pessoas em sofrimento, num sofrimento, por vezes, intenso, de muitos anos perdidos, enfim, não perdi tempo noutro slide, mas de facto o impacto que tem a depressão, sobretudo as perturbações depressivas, é muito grande em termos de dias e anos de trabalho perdido, em termos de sofrimento familiar, de sofrimento pessoal. E temos então um conjunto grande de pessoas que as séries variam, mas podem ir a 30%, 40%, em alguns casos até 50% de pessoas com depressões que são resistentes, de facto, às formas tradicionais, que, como sabemos, é uma combinação de fármacos antidepressivos, enfim, potenciados às vezes por outras combinações, e psicoterapia. Foi aqui referida à CBT, mas qualquer forma de psicoterapia, enfim, as meta-análises dizem que as principais têm a mesma eficácia. Bem, mesmo com esta combinação, sabemos que a combinação destes dois métodos é superior à utilização de cada um deles individualmente, mas mesmo assim nós temos 30% de pessoas, vamos pelos números mais baixos, resistentes, portanto, cujas perturbações depressivas são resistentes a estas formas terapêuticas. É para essas que nós dirigimos a nossa atenção, a estas pessoas em grande sofrimento, e que nós de facto utilizamos primordialmente o nosso programa, embora isso não fosse uma obrigatoriedade. Enfim, estamos a seguir as guidelines até internacionais, mas evidentemente poderíamos, e há aqui visões dentro deste mundo destas terapias dos psicodélicos, visões mais alargadas e visões mais restritas. É preciso ter isso em atenção para situarmos as coisas, mas esta tem sido de facto a nossa atenção primordial. Não só depressões resistentes, mas também perturbações de ansiedade, que têm um impacto também muito grande, perturbações de stress pós-traumático, que é a única que não temos ainda, como iremos ver, uma experiência de diagnóstico principal, mas iremos ter em breve, se tudo correr bem, um protocolo que estamos em vias de fazer, vamos ter também este tipo de intervenção. perturbações do comportamento alimentar e perturbações por abuso de substâncias. Aqui estamos a falar especificamente da perturbação por uso de álcool. A nossa história, não vos vou amassar muito com isto, mas começa, de facto, em 22, 23, durante um ano, 3 pessoas, enfim, um gestor de topo, um farmacêutico de topo e uma psicoterapeuta também de topo, juntam-se e começam a pensar em fundar uma clínica que possa ajudar estas pessoas em sofrimento, fazem as suas pesquisas e chegam à conclusão que a Awaken será a melhor parceria, preparam tudo e de facto, isso vai permitir então a fundação da Clinic of Change em julho de 23 e depois na sua história em que começamos com um núcleo, digamos assim, de um psiquiatra, que no caso era eu, isto em termos inicialmente, não é? 3 psicoterapeutas muito treinados, 2 enfermeiros e 3 farmacêuticos e esta, digamos assim, esta equipa que começa logo com, de facto, com um contacto muito intenso com a Awaken, vamos com supervisão, com discussão de casos e arrancamos então com 8 pacientes que são, digamos assim, pacientes 0. E a partir daí, as coisas vão se desenvolvendo. Eu vou apresentar os resultados preliminares relativamente a 48 pacientes, isto até junho de 24, congelámos aqui, mas claro que a vida continuou e hoje já temos à volta de 60 pacientes seguidos aqui, mas os últimos dados já não estão incluídos, porque era preciso congelar, a uma dada altura, para podermos apresentar e estudar os resultados e estes resultados, isto dá muito trabalho. Porquê a Awaken? Porque a Awaken podiam ser outras, mas houve uma pesquisa, foram pesquisadas várias clínicas, várias enfim, empresas e instituições que trabalham nesta área. A Awaken foi a que achámos que dava mais garantias de cientificidade, desde logo, de fundamentação científica sólida, de investigação empírica, também de trabalho de supervisão, de apoio, de discussão de casos. Dá-me muita segurança, por exemplo, coisas tão simples como estar num grupo do WhatsApp com alguns dos psiquiatras que mais têm experiência no mundo relativamente a este tipo de intervenção e poder mandar-lhes uma mensagem sobre um caso e, enfim, alguns minutos depois ter uma resposta da experiência de um desses colegas. Enfim, há de facto aqui um apoio, houve, sobretudo inicialmente, evidentemente que as pessoas quando vão crescendo vão precisando, exatamente como as crianças, vão precisando cada vez menos de supervisão parental e vão cada vez mais andando sozinhas, mas inicialmente foi de facto muito importante e sobretudo também nos convenceu, por um lado, a experiência do programa já em várias clínicas um pouco por todo o mundo, e também o facto de haver digamos assim, esta ligação, por isso é que está aqui o professor David Nutt do Imperial College e a professora Cialia da Universidade de Exeter, que é uma universidade muito conhecida na área da investigação. E não podia faltar também as ligações aqui a instituições portuguesas, o ISB, o Instituto Baseado na Evidência, ouvimos já o professor Vasco Carneiro hoje, e o ISPA não podia faltar, porque o ISPA é a minha casa, não é? E, portanto, e a casa de muitos de nós é também a minha casa e, evidentemente, temos, então, uma parceria também com o ISPA e vamos ter o privilégio também de ouvir o professor António José dos Santos a fechar aqui os nossos trabalhos de hoje. Bom, como é que se desenrola o programa? Desenrola-se, como eu digo, é um programa empiricamente validado, depois de uma avaliação médica inicial, rigorosa, que consiste fundamentalmente numa entrevista estruturada, mas também depois, enfim, em todos os aspectos, mesmo que não estejam na própria entrevista estruturada, mas que são elicitados pelo próprio paciente, pelas situações que possam existir com o paciente. Como eu vos disse, a ketamina É uma substância muito segura, mas o que não implica que não tenha que não haja alguns aspectos a ter em conta. Por exemplo, situações de hipertensão não controlada, situações também de aumento da tensão intraocular, por exemplo, são situações que têm que se ter cuidado. Bem, e aquelas situações gerais de insuficiências graves cardíacas, renais, hepáticas, evidentemente, são situações sempre que se tem que ponderar muito bem. Mas é uma substância segura. Por outro lado, do ponto de vista psiquiátrico, também terem atenção, situações psicóticas, quadros psicóticos, enfim, não terão indicação, o que não quer dizer que as pessoas piorassem com a intervenção. Muito pelo contrário, há dados preliminares que mostram que até melhorariam, mas por não havendo, lá está, evidência científica sólida dessas melhorias, nós não utilizamos nessas situações, assim como quadros maníacos, por exemplo, agudos, ativos, são coisas que não poderão integrar o programa. Enfim, uma vez aprovado, e a maior parte das pessoas, de facto, acabam por ser aprovadas, temos 2 sessões de preparação, num total de 11 sessões já propriamente da terapia, depois da avaliação, 2 sessões de preparação, 4 sessões propriamente de ketamina, imediatamente seguidas cada uma delas, isto com uma periodicidade que nós costumamos fazer semanal, imediatamente seguidas no dia seguinte de uma sessão de integração psicoterapêutica, que é absolutamente fundamental e faz a diferença, não é? Faz a diferença, não só porque temos apenas psicoterapeutas com muita experiência, mas sobretudo para aproveitar também a questão da neuroplasticidade cerebral, a janela de oportunidade da neuroplasticidade cerebral, que está ali muito ativa durante 3 dias, enfim, 2 dias, fundamentalmente 2, 3 dias no máximo. E, portanto, queremos aproveitar isso para a tal reestruturação a nível cognitivo, emocional, a nível da visão do mundo, de maneira a que a pessoa, enfim, aqueles circuitos que são sempre os mesmos, muito sedimentados, acabem por ser outro e que levam à patologia, não é? Ouvimos já o professor David Nutt a falar da questão do desligar o Default Mode System, Network e acabar por haver aqui, de facto, um aumento das ligações, da conectividade cerebral, não o tal cérebro entrópico, que vai permitir que, quando se volta a reorganizar, se reorganize de uma maneira que já não é a mesma dos tais loopings que levam à preservação nos pensamentos e nos sintomas da patologia. E, por fim, temos, então, depois uma sessão de fecho, em que o fecho com o psicoterapeuta, mas que há também uma alta médica. E quero também já aproveitar para agradecer a todos os colegas psiquiatras e psicólogos que nos têm também referenciado os pacientes, sabendo que os seguiam antes e que nós não roubamos pacientes a ninguém e que voltam aos seus psiquiatras e aos seus psicólogos, enfim, sempre com a esperança, que na maior parte dos casos é realizada, de que voltem muito melhor do que quando entraram aqui, e embora quero chamar a atenção, e isto tem a ver com o tal vender gato por lebre, que nós temos uma percentagem de pessoas que não respondem, andará à volta de 30%. É muito importante, e eu digo sempre isso, logo na sessão, na IMA, eu e os meus colegas que fazemos, dizemos sempre isso, quer dizer, não vamos, as pessoas, claro que as pessoas fazem as contas, nós não temos a possibilidade, não temos ainda indicadores seguros para saber se a pessoa vai cair nos 70 ou nos 30, e a maior parte das pessoas faz as contas de cabeça e diz, bem, há mais probabilidade de estar nos 70 do que nos 30. E tendo eu já tentado tudo e não tendo resultado nada, bom, então vou de facto experimentar, mas eu deixo isto muito claro, porque alguém tem que calhar nos 30. E, portanto, isso é uma coisa que para mim deixo sempre claro. E depois temos também evoluções diferentes. Temos pessoas que respondem logo, os chamados early responders, respondem logo. Logo no final da primeira sessão de ketamina, a pessoa diz, eu sinto-me muito melhor. Há quantos anos eu não me sentia assim? Antes da depressão, que já dura muitas vezes há 5, 10, 15 anos, e eu volto a sentir-me bem. coisa que eu não sabia o que era já há muito tempo, já me tinha esquecido que isto era possível. Bom, isto são os early responders. Mas também há os chamados standard responders, não é? Que vão respondendo à medida do tratamento, e há os late responders, aqueles que só respondem mesmo no final, na última sessão, ou às vezes já depois do tratamento concluído, quando vamos fazer a sessão de encerramento, e é que as pessoas dizem, realmente estou muito melhor, não notei durante o tratamento grandes mudanças, mas estou muito melhor. E temos, infelizmente, os tais 30% de non-responders. A equipa agora alargou-se, entretanto, daquele núcleo inicial, 3 psiquiatras, 4 psicoterapeutas experimentados, 4 enfermeiros, e aqui realçar a importância dos enfermeiros, não só nas próprias sessões, mas também a questão de que todos eles são treinados e bem treinados, todos eles têm o curso de suporte avançado de vida e, portanto, estão preparados para atuar em qualquer circunstância, mesmo que não tenha a ver diretamente com a ketamina, porque, enfim, isso pode acontecer em qualquer situação, qualquer, enfim, intercorrência, e três farmacêuticos que nos dão apoio e que fazem double check com os enfermeiros na preparação da própria substância para ser então injetada intramuscularmente. Bom, a questão da investigação é feita a partir de um conjunto, largo de questionários e escalas, instrumentos de avaliação psicológica, portanto, há a avaliação propriamente médica inicial, o médico depois está sempre presente nas sessões de ketamina e vai acompanhando sempre o caso, mas temos de facto todo um conjunto de instrumentos de avaliação psicológica, portanto, em que vamos medindo as diferentes dimensões psicológicas e psicopatológicas para que se possa então fazer comparações e é a partir daqui que nós podemos depois recolher os nossos dados. Aí também a Awaken é importante na medida em que há uma rede de investigação internacional. 48, vou falar-vos de 48 pacientes que entraram no programa, corresponde a 380 sessões, muitas horas, medidas, e de facto corresponde já a algum trabalho apresentado, nomeadamente, ultimamente, só realço 5 pósteres no nosso Congresso Nacional de Psiquiatria, que foi que acabou há algumas semanas. Também temos dropouts. Não esconder esta parte, aliás, aqui não se esconde nada. Há dropouts. Isto é, dos 48, de facto, 25% de pessoas que, pelos mais variados motivos, acabaram por não chegar ao fim ou não responderam ao follow-up e, portanto, isto tanto no nosso CAP como no nosso CARE. O que é o CAP e o CARE? O CARE tem a ver, enfim, Ketamine Assisted Psychotherapy, é o programa que eu vos apresentei imediatamente antes e que está mais voltado para as diferentes questões ligadas às perturbações depressivas e ansiosas, e também ao stress pós-traumático e às perturbações de comportamento alimentar, e o CARE está voltado para a prevenção da recaída na perturbação de uso por álcool. Portanto, não é um programa para parar de beber, digamos assim, é um programa para prevenir recaídas, porque aí enfim, parar de beber é fácil e parar qualquer substância é fácil. O que é difícil é não recair. E aí é que, de facto, os programas tradicionais, como todos sabem, têm de facto, índices de recaída muito altos. E é aqui que, de facto, que também o que era, como foi mostrado, tem sido mostrado e continua o estudo, a professora Cecília Morgan que falou nisso, tem um papel importante, embora nós tenhamos ainda um número relativamente pequeno de pacientes para também falarmos, digamos assim, da nossa experiência. O número pequeno, tanto enquanto para CAP temos um N de 42, aqui temos apenas 6 pacientes. E, portanto, não podemos ainda ter a mesma, digamos, segurança em termos dos nossos números e da comparação com outros números, porque o N ainda é muito pequeno. Bom, e temos aqui alguns aspectos que possam ser importantes, a média de idades, 42, 51, o sexo masculino, que está a bold. Curiosamente, nós temos uma maioria de homens, a maior parte, o que é tradicional, mas isso está a mudar. Está a mudar. Eu já tinha notado isso no meu próprio consultório e acabo por verificar também aqui na clínica. Está a mudar e os homens acorrem agora em número muito maior do que antes. Enfim, há vários programas de saúde mental e, portanto, a saúde mental masculina está a começar, de facto, a ter uma maior atenção. O diagnóstico principal, o que temos realmente 62%, é a depressão, que é, de facto, a grande indicação, mas, atenção, que já há, como eu já vos disse, já há evidência sólida, que pode não ser tão grande como no caso da depressão, para outras perturbações, e, portanto, temos também outras perturbações tratadas. No caso aqui, a eating disorder, portanto, a perturbação de comportamento alimentar, apenas um caso da anorexia, com sucesso. E, portanto, ficamos muito satisfeitos, porque, como sabem, é uma patologia difícil de tratar, e aqui tivemos, de facto, sucesso. Há aqui casos que não estão, mas um deles, por exemplo, deixa-me muito orgulhoso, que é um caso de OCD, portanto, perturbação obsessivo-compulsiva, de um rapaz que tinha, de facto, era completamente prisioneiro dos números e dos trânsitos solares. E a prisão dos números era não conseguir entrar em portas com certos números, não conseguir, nos dias de calendário com certos números, não sair de casa, porque lhe ia acontecer alguma coisa mal. Aliás, quando eu lhe perguntei, então, e que números são esses? Não, eu vou dizer os números que não têm problema, porque esses não os posso dizer. E ficou completamente liberto desta problemática dos números. E, portanto, foi uma resposta grande. Em relação aos trânsitos solares, não. Ainda continua prisioneiro dos trânsitos solares e dos dias em que há e não há problemas ao nível dos trânsitos solares. Não sou capaz de vos explicar mais que isto, não sei nada da astrologia, mas ele sabia dizer. Agora, mas ele próprio disse, não, valeu a pena, não estou curado, mas valeu a pena. O simples facto da libertação dos números, que era das coisas que mais me aprisionava, eu era prisioneiro dentro da minha própria vida, foi um avanço extraordinário, não é? E ficou-nos muito grato por essa situação. Bom, e agora o nosso slide principal. E o nosso slide principal é este, de facto, em que temos todo um conjunto de os instrumentos medidos, portanto, no princípio e no fim, as diferentes dimensões, a depressão, a ansiedade, uma medida geral, o OK45, medida geral das relações interpessoais, o funcionamento no trabalho e social, e vemos então que, de facto, aqui chama a atenção são aquilo que é significativo, as descidas que são significativas em cada um destes instrumentos. Temos para o CAP e para o CARE, mas no CARE, como eu disse, temos menos pessoas. E vejam isto, não é? Portanto, é significativo uma descida de 3, e aqui estamos a falar do conjunto dos casos, não é? E passamos de 16 para 9, portanto, uma descida de 7. Muito mais do que significativo. E há outras coisas, então, mesmo espetaculares aqui, não é? Uma medida menos 41, quando é significativo uma descida de 14, isto em termos do conjunto, não é? Em termos do conjunto, depois tínhamos que ver em cada um. E aqui também uma melhoria muito significativa ao nível do funcionamento social e no trabalho, que é o que interessa às pessoas, não é? A serem funcionais, que é o que também a nossa sociedade hoje exige, e há, de facto, também aqui mudanças muito significativas. No CARE, com menos gente, mas também temos aqui números que me parecem, de facto, que me deixam muito satisfeito. E deixam-me satisfeito muito mais até do que propriamente estes números, é ver as pessoas, não é? Ver as pessoas gratas, ver as pessoas muito melhor quando entram e quando saem, e ver as pessoas, de facto, a terem, como eu vos disse, a estarem em estados que não sabiam já o que era há muitos anos. Mas é sempre preciso depois, enfim, quantificar e percebermos se são apenas impressões subjetivas ou wishful thinking dos terapeutas, ou se de facto são números que estão, isto são muitas preenchidos pelas próprias pessoas, e portanto, e muitas vezes as próprias pessoas, ao ver os gráficos, eu aqui não trouxe gráficos, porque preferi sintetizar aqui num quadro síntese, mas a entrega a cada pessoa no final do tratamento, os seus próprios resultados com os seus gráficos, e as pessoas ao ver os gráficos ainda ficam mais satisfeitas, porque veem de facto as curvas a descer, e elas já tinham essa sensação subjetiva, mas depois, de certo modo, veem isso objetivado nos próprios gráficos do relatório final do tratamento que nós fazemos questão de entregar às pessoas, para elas levarem ao seu psiquiatra, no caso de o terem, e ao seu psicólogo, ao seu terapeuta também, para além de estarmos sempre disponíveis para falar com quaisquer clínicos sobre estas situações. Muito rapidamente falar de dois casos, um de CAP e outro de CARE, como podem ver ali. Portanto, temos aqui uma mulher de 31 anos, com um diagnóstico principal de perturbação de ansiedade, mas também comorbilidade com depressão resistente e também consumo de cannabis, e que acabou, de facto, podem ver aqui os resultados, passando para números de 17 para 2, quase inexistente em termos de depressão, sintomas depressivos, a ansiedade desapareceu, o desconforto, e passou então de uma incapacidade grave para uma incapacidade ligeira. Portanto, um caso de sucesso, como eu digo e repito 30%, não, que eu repito isto muitas vezes, não respondem, para não iludir ninguém, mas este é um caso, entre muitos que nós temos, de facto, onde nós percebemos, estamos a falar, também volto a repetir, de depressão resistente, pessoas que já passaram, pelo menos, por 2 antidepressivos, em doses otimizadas, e também, muitas vezes, com associações de otimização, e por psicoterapia, não é? Vários tipos de psicoterapia e anos de psicoterapia sem resultado. Outro do CARE, em que temos aqui então um homem de 51 anos, como sabem, enfim, no caso da perturbação do uso de álcool é maior a prevalência no género masculino, 51 anos, casado, 3 filhos, fez o programa CARE e vemos também que há aqui digamos, um efeito espetacular. Esta pessoa até acabou por dar o seu testemunho. Podem ver alguns dos testemunhos no site da Clinic of Care. De facto, e temos aqui estes scores que mostram enfim, uma diminuição muito franca e ficando praticamente assintomático e, o que é também o mais importante, abstinente, e portanto, continua abstinente. Alguns testemunhos já foram também referidos pelo professor David Nutt e pela professora Cília, mas alguns testemunhos aqui de pessoas que, enfim, tiveram a amabilidade de testemunhar com este fármaco e o acompanhamento, foi-me finalmente permitido ir à raiz dos meus problemas, compreendendo os porquês de tanto sofrimento. Hoje estou livre do álcool, recuperei a minha família, a minha sanidade, a minha alegria de viver. E como é bom viver. Eu tive resultados imediatos, mas também a longo prazo. Neste momento, apesar de ter terminado a terapia, eu fiquei com muitas ferramentas. Neste momento, acordo todos os dias de manhã e só digo, bora viver. Outra situação, e é isto que realmente nos dá a maior satisfação. O meu medo é precisamente aquilo que a pandemia evoca, são os espaços vazios, tudo vazio. Estava muito perra, tinha muita falta de vontade. A ketamina meteu-me predisposta para voltar a tentar, para alcançar mais liberdade. Uma jovem com agorafobia. Não fiquei meio curada ou pouco curada. Eu realmente fiquei curada da depressão. A psicoterapia assistida por psicadélicos, esta pessoa também deu o testemunho, podem ver, é um tratamento muito simples que nos faz voltar à vida. Eu quero contar isso a toda a gente, portanto, uma entusiasta do nosso tratamento. A Clinic of Change não é uma clínica só de tratamento de psicoterapia. A Clinic of Change hoje é uma clínica de saúde mental com diferentes vertentes entre as quais, claro, a nossa imagem de marca é de facto a psicoterapia assistida por ketamina, não é? Porque com uma abordagem que me parece nossa, digamos assim, nossa no sentido aqui em Portugal, mas estamos preparados para a terapia com esketamina também. Temos pessoas em acompanhamento psiquiátrico, nada tem a ver com a ketamina, a psicoterapia, vários tipos de psicoterapia, para outros casos, psicologia clínica e também jovens acompanhados em psiquiatria da infância e da adolescência. E, portanto, é esta diversificação também e o facto de não estarmos apenas ligados a uma terapia, por muito boa que ela seja, mas a um leque alargado e termos uma visão alargada da saúde mental que nos faz encarar o futuro com muita confiança. Muito obrigado pela vossa atenção.
Muito obrigado, Vítor. Vamos então iniciar o nosso painel de debate. Eu ia convidar então o professor António José Santos para se juntar aqui a nós. O professor António José Santos é professor catedrático de Psicologia do ISPA Instituto Universitário, e membro fundador do William James Center for Research. E esperando que ele se sente e se junte a nós, I will change to English. So I will ask one question first to him, Professor António José Santos. After 1 year, what you see different? What are the new things that come from these experiences, internationally and nationally? And at the same time, what was below your expectations?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here for the second time. Well, I would like to say that I'm very happy, but actually I'm a little frightened. I don't know if I'm trembling. I don't know if it's because of the cold or the task. Of course, that just hearing my colleague Vítor, it is remarkable that in such a little amount of time, their dream is now put in practice. They gather not only the knowledge, the contacts, collaborators, other institutions, Awaken, etc., but were able also to learn and implement this approach. And to be quite honest, when we look to, it looks like 70% of efficacy. Yes, of course, in 100 means 30 people, that doesn't work. 1,000, well, it's 3,000, it's 300 people, and we go like that. 1 million is a lot of people that can't. But anyway, it's very, very uplifting. Because rarely, I believe, in the health general domain, we have any program or intervention. I wish that we in psychology, for example, we could have in our different disciplines. 70% is remarkable. You know, like this is a little like playing cards. When things are a little above 50%, we become very happy. 55, 56, 60%, 70% is really remarkable, and really indicates that the framework is actually quite heuristic, promising, and I would say that perhaps in a decade, this 70%, which is the sort of percentage that is also found in other initiatives, will increase. Will increase because, as you saw, and David Nutt is a pioneer and also almost like a prophet once you have been in the Vatican too. And you saw so clearly when he talked to us about neuroplasticity, the default networks, these remarkable advances in molecular biology that now can help us understand how can we change the brain, right? And changing the brain, we have this window of opportunity to change our mind, right? Actually, I brought this because this is, I didn't use, but these are the kinds of little books that we give to our students that says, I'm going to change the world. That's what Portuguese flag, you know, green. And now I'm going to tell them, like our marketing thing, I'm going to change the world by changing the politicians, because that's, I believe, the greatest, when I look to this year, that this is a great message. We have not only to have these meetings and exchange this information, but we have to be able to communicate to the instances, to the responsibles for, you know, our state agencies and our international agencies, etc., because that's probably the most important also message to take from here today. As Celia Morgan also very well demonstrated to us, yeah, okay, neuroplasticity, for sure, that's the window, that's the opportunity, but, you know, the psychotherapy, ketamine assisted with psychotherapy, seems to be like, you know, the real punch, right, in the end. So that is also remarkable. I believe it's, again, it's a confirmation. This kind of programs have already gave their extreme hopeful results for the future. But it's also, for me, very important to stress at this moment that CBT, of course, you know, probably the form of intervention that is more easily manualized, transformed into a manual, and much more. Of course, we have seen the results. I really love the call of attention to the phenomenology, the mystical, the metaphysical. I myself, because before I was, you know, my passion for psychoanalysis. In my first years, I was a phenomenal existentialist. You know, so anyway, it's very, very important to understand precisely that at the same time we are here in a sort of a potential bidirectional effect. You know, because if we change the brain, we change the mind also as she evolves and change, also then reflects and also change the ongoing brain neurobiological processes. So I am very happy also that you clearly teach us about that so important take. CAP, care, some distances, some differences in terms of the objective, and also this kind of, we could say globally, these perturbations or humor disorders. You know? And because you made me that in this last year, I've been reading mostly, and some of the more here colleagues and former students from ISPA that also share this passion for psychoanalysis. I've been reading the most that I can, and it's true that most of the psychoanalytic-oriented studies are, well, anecdotal, some of them, but they are growing. And the message that at least to be, I would say, faithful to myself, is that for sure CBT, phenomenology, are already proven ways of precisely disrupt maladaptive behaviors and thoughts, and for sure, and they are very, very successful. I do believe that, on the other hand, and maybe not everybody has the characteristics to do that, sometimes also these perturbations are due to more profound unconscious problematics. You talked about trauma, for example, others. Then I believe that that could be the contribution of psychoanalytic oriented interventions. And that's what my hope for the future, right? To see in the clinic of change, to see precisely those those interventions side by side, care, cap, and you know, just
We'll see it
Keep
in
the ball rolling.
2 years of change.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the second year of change. So now it's time to open to the public. Vamos então algumas questões que queiram colocar. Podem se sentir-se mais confortáveis, podem colocar em português. Eu farei o meu melhor a tentar traduzir. Como viram, o inglês não é o meu ponto mais forte, mas farei o meu melhor.
Hello, my name is Inês. It's a privilege to be here and to watch Professor Nat and Professor Celia. So welcome to Lisbon. Always come back. I have just a couple of comments and a couple of questions. I'm a doctor, not into psychiatry, but with a lot of interest in psychedelic medicine. So I would also like to share that in Portugal, we didn't have the Vietnam War, but most of our population, adult population, had the colony war. Okay, so Portuguese, I would say men from 60 to 75, a lot of them went to war. So we also have a traumatized population like the United States has. And of course, secondary traumatization to families, etc., etc. So in Portugal, that's a very significant remark about our population. I was wondering about the clinical practicalities. So regarding this, now specifically to Dr. Vitor Amorim, so when you define success with a mean follow-up of 6 months, I would really like you to comment on that. How can you define success actually on a person that has been suffering for years, and how would be the metrics medium to long term, and what are the plans from the clinic of change to moving forward to define success? Secondly, I realized that most of the patients that are also in alcoholism, they also scored very high on the severe to moderate depression and anxiety. So obviously there's an overlap. So of course there's intricate pathways. So, and my last question is, what do you do with previous medication? Do they stop medication? Do you define success as they're off antidepressants? How are the practical managing issues about your approach? Thank you so much and congratulations.
So I believe you're not a psychiatrist.
Maybe we can start the first part. Maybe you can go to the trauma and some data, and also both David and Celia, you can approach the cutting point. Why do you stop at 3, 6, or 12 months? What are the main data that we have, and then we can come to Vitor about our specific data.
Okay, well, I just want to agree with you. I spent 3 years of my life sitting in the next office to David Clark as he was developing CBT, or at least CT. And I could never fully understand why he thought, and others think, you can simply use words to deal with trauma. Because trauma is, it's well beneath words. Even in the brain, we know it's in a different part of the brain to where you hold, your semantic reasoning. So I always thought this just was a little bit too optimistic, and I guess most people would agree with me now, although he won't. So anyway, I'm with the brain is much more complicated than just the way in which you actually verbalize things.
You want to add something, Celia?
Well, I can talk about the pragmatic 6-month thing, sorry, on a different level. Yeah, and part of that is, in alcohol as well, is kind of around the duration that we can follow people in clinical trials. So I don't know if you were presenting it, Vitor, to be consistent with those other data. Because obviously clinical trials are these hugely unwieldy things, and it's really hard to follow people. We would love to follow people up for 12 months. That's what we're doing in our new study. But we took 6 months. It is kind of a predictor of then relapse at 12 months. So we know, I think, with the relapse rates at 6 months are predictive of 12 months. Yeah. So It seems like, but yeah, ideally we would follow people up for years, and I think it's nice to see that's what you are doing there in the Clinic of Change, right? But it's only been 1 year.
3,
so
6, 9, and 12.
12 months, and 12 months is a great, but yeah, maybe you wouldn't have all of those data for...
Yeah, but I understand the question. How can you say there is, if I understood well, no? There is success with only 6 months. What after? But the long-term studies are very difficult to do, and the success is comparing the scores in our psychological tests at the beginning and 6 months after. Sure, you are right. Some of these are going to relapse, and that's true. But this is what we can. The clinic has 1 year, as you saw. So, even if we had 5, 10 years, it's very difficult to do long-term. 5 years results, longitudinal studies. Are very difficult. As you saw, Professor Vascarneiro said that in psychiatry the studies are more difficult than in other. We have huge numbers. If you want to know if cholesterol is down, you can collect data from thousands of people and to see. And here it's difficult, but I think we can talk about success comparing these numbers, and especially listening to the people, which are the main experiences of the success. People that said that, thank you. This is I didn't felt this way long years ago. You asked 2 other questions.
One was linked with medicines, I think. The one was linked with medicines before and after.
Yeah. The
Antidepressants before or for some period, or how do you...
yeah, I personally, but there is here some kind of liberty from the psychiatrist who is following the case. The doctor has some liberty to do what he thinks is best for the patient, but I personally don't touch much, don't modify much the medication, except the pharmacs that I know that are going to somehow prejudice the treatment. For instance, benzodiazepines are going to be lowered down slowly because we know that we might not have the best results if the patient is taking them. SSRIs I don't use to modify the doses, but what happens is that after the treatment, the psychiatrist, it's me or any other, if the person has a previous psychiatrist, it's the psychiatrist who does that. You are better, so we are going to now to the maintenance dose, or even to stop the pharmacology. It might happen. Some people stays with the doses of long term just to prevent relapses, but that's the best judgment of the psychiatrist that is following the person. And the third one was. Okay.
Can I just say something? Because I'm 64, and I was 14 in 1974. So hopefully I didn't went to the war. So as I'm 64, men that went to the war, they are over 70. Yes. No, but the important, no, this is just for, just kidding. The important thing is that, quite honestly, there were children, babies during those years. There are their wives, family, people. So just to tell you that the war, or the effects of the war are not over. They are transgenerational, and unfortunately, they are still present in our culture. And we are a culture, for example, where depression and violence We just know the tip of the iceberg, because there's actually 19% of this iceberg. We don't know, our authorities don't know, even our health system, but clearly that was a bad heritage from those decades, more than 1 decade, almost 2 decades of war for sure. Yeah.
About
Sorry.
that, yeah, about that I want to say something also. I forgot that was your question. I am consultant and I do the evaluation of the military that were in the war. I do most of the evaluation and the assessment for incapacity and so forth. They are, it was 50 years ago. They are not 60s, they are 70s and 80s. Most of them are not eligible to this treatment because they have a lot of comorbidities and severe comorbidities. But the ones which are, it's the ones that the military, I mean, that went to the following wars that came, and Portuguese troops were there. I mean, Afghanistan, I mean in the Central Europe, I mean in Africa, Central Africa. And those, yes, we are willing to have a protocol to treat them. And we are eager to that, but we must wait a little to have that opportunity.
I was going to add that because we are working with a military hospital, try to find a way to work and cooperate together. We are still working on that. And just an additional topic, I'm not part of the panel. I'm the pharmacist of the clinic. And I'm saying that it's important to say, even when you see the time is always comparable to the usual treatment at the same time. So even if you look at 3 weeks, 1 month, 3 months, whatever, it compares always with the usual treatment that people, or usual way they were if they don't have the treatment. So at the same time, you have less relapse than they have with the usual treatment. That's a key point that I would like to add. One more question.
Good afternoon, and first of all, I would like to say that it's always an honor to have Professor David Nutt again here and Professor Cecilia Morgan. I still remember the first conference that I watched of Professor David Nutt and Professor Cecilia Morgan. And I have some questions for Professor David Nutt and for Professor Cecilia Morgan. First question, this is more for Professor David Nutt, is that you mentioned that, well, surprisingly, the Catholic Church is interested also in the study of psychedelics, right? And you touch on some themes like the mystic themes of the psychedelic trips, and one thing that I've been noticing, I don't know if I'm wrong, but it's some sort of universality of themes on psychedelic trips. Yeah. And one of the most surprising things that I have heard is that many people who are completely skeptic in any religion, they don't believe in Buddha or God, in a psychedelic trip, they become believers of something that they didn't believe before. And I would like to ask you if there are many situations like this in your investigations, and your opinion about why this phenomenon happens. And the second question is that concerning psilocybin. You mentioned about psilocybin and its effects on depression, and knowing that many of those depressions come from severe traumas, if there are any observational studies on patients, for example, what patients report, interviews, that can measure and show scientific evidence of the effects of psilocybin in trauma, in releasing trauma. And you speak also, and this is more for Professor Cecilia Morgan, about resistance to investigation. I would like to know, for new scientists who are about to start investigation on this of psychedelics, what obstacles can they find in mentalities and how to move on these obstacles. And also, I would like to ask if the personality is more like an extrapharmacological subject, more like a personality. If personality traits are able to increase the success of the treatment and reduce the obstacles for the treatment, if personality has such an impact on it, and future suggestions of futures, if there are any future studies on psilocybin, any decreasing effects on schizophrenia and bipolarity. Those are my questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, so shall I kick off, see if I can remember the first one about spirituality? I think, I'm going to try to quote William James, but because I think he said something along the lines that the ultimate solution for essentially being an alcoholic was to become a anarcho-maniac was to become a religiomaniac, to substitute your belief system. And of course, that actually then underpinned a lot of the whole philosophy, the 12-step philosophy of Alcoholics Anonymous, which was trying to find some greater meaning than what ethanol gives you. I think the processes of the brain processes underlying religious experiences have got to be very similar, and that's to those of psychedelics. They're just achieved in different ways. It's not all of us can afford 40 days in the desert, but most of us can afford a retreat somewhere. Anyway, so that's kind of part of what I was. I don't know. I actually don't know whether I took the right tack with the Vatican. I don't know, but I thought at the very least they've heard it, so they can make their own minds. In terms of trauma, it's a really important question. Most of the people we see with chronic depression have been traumatized, but they got depression. We know that trauma, acute trauma, if it leads to psychological, mental health problems, 50% of them are depression and 50% are PTSD. So trauma is kind of central to pretty much what we're doing. But there's much less research on formally treating PTSD with psychedelics than there is with depression. But it will come, and I'm sure it'll be effective in that. And the big challenge I find, it's kind of weird for me to say this, here I am, a biological psychiatrist, but I'm becoming more and more interested in Klein, because the childhood trauma seems to have such a defining impact on the way the person grows up and how the person relates to the world, that it's hard to understand. I'd like to understand it biologically, but I think psychologically you've got to understand it. And so and again, it ain't CBT, because they've been traumatized before they can even kind of formulate sentences.
Shall I take it?
Yeah.
So back to your question actually about religious experiences. There is a study, because not everyone develops that, but you're right, that's such a common theme, about people who can tolerate uncertainty. So this idea that psychedelics give you this ontological shock, so suddenly the world, you're kind of all of your beliefs about the world are unsettled, and some people cannot tolerate that and some people can't. And I think those kind of crystallizing back down to more rigid belief systems is something. I think I've forgotten who the author is, but there's a study looking at uncertainty tolerance before psychedelics, and that's predictive of these kind of more religious conversion-like experience. There's also the metaphysical changes that people have shown. Shifts from more materialist understandings of the world to things like panpsychism, so the belief, or pantheism, that God's everywhere, mind's everywhere. So maybe something about the unitive psychedelic experience kind of relates to that. But yeah, and that's not the question you asked me. But it's really interesting. It's a fascinating area. I think you were saying, was it about obstacles? Yes, there's so many. I was just reflecting on that. Obstacles in people changing people's minds that you're working with. There's kind of the pragmatic obstacles of the kind of Schedule 1 regulations and getting the permissions to do the research. And then some people, it's, I guess we move in psychedelic circles, right? So you kind of, I think that people's minds are changed, but a lot of people are still very skeptical about this. So I think maybe So from a colleague group from McShane, you have to make these things boring, and then then they will be more accepted kind of in the wider sphere. So I think that's one of the challenges. So there's still a kind of seductive allure of psychedelics, and I guess because they've been associated with the counterculture. I mean, that's changing now with kind of capitalism being involved more and more. And there's there's a really interesting article written recently about the far right and the far left and how psychedelics kind of unite the two. Anyway, going off as a tangent. But yeah, so the obstacles, I think, to make it boring, so make psychedelics boring, and then you kind of bring people along. In terms of medical prescription, no offense to the doctors, but yeah, because a lot of people still, it's risky, they're risky, and maybe that's why ketamine has a bit more traction, because it is a Schedule 2 medicine only. People can look it up in a book, look up the side effects. You can get it from the pharmacy, so it's already more boring than traditional psychedelics. And then what your final question about?
Was if there are any future studies to be made on the impact of psychosis
Psychosis. Yeah. There's some interesting work going on already, a little bit with bipolar with ketamine, and someone called Benjamin Mudge, do you know him? Dave, yeah, who's been doing some work with ayahuasca. Not sure if you're aware of his work. He's been doing a PhD on this, looking at bipolar, but more on the psychotic end of bipolar. It's obviously one of those areas that is kind of at the frontier. I'm speaking to people practicing in retreat settings. People have found benefit, and other kind of, not in clinical trials, basically. People with psychosis have found benefit from psychedelics if they're held, in the right space. But it's something, I think, in terms of risk, that we don't really go there. But yeah, I think it would be interesting. I don't know, do you know of any studies with psychosis?
No, I mean, the current approach to using psychedelics for psychosis is to use non-psychedelic doses to see if the neuroplastic, we don't actually know whether there are neuroplastic benefits at non-psychedelic doses, but supposing there are, then they could be helpful, particularly in terms of the sort of cognitive dysfunction in schizophrenia. That's where the field is currently mostly invested. But could I just say one other thing? I mean, we didn't mention it, but one great advantage of ketamine is it works even if you're on most other medicines apart from effect. I suppose lamotrigine is probably the only drug that blocks the effects of ketamine, isn't it? So that gives it, it has a broader utility. That's why you can use it in people on SSRIs. We're still not sure what the best thing to do is for people who are on SSRIs. We used to get them off, but that was difficult. Now we're sort of keeping them on, but no one really knows what's the ideal.
Okay, more questions?
I would like to applaud this magnificent event, because I was coming as a little with the mental reservations, but I'm very impressed with the data and with also the scientific rationale behind. And I would like just to, I'm very enthusiastic, and I think I'm going to send patients to you. What I would like to understand is this question better. What is the purpose of this therapy? Is to make the possibility of changing of evolution, and how you think you can contribute for the transformation of the setting of the patients you involve. Because I think there are different things. I understand you can, with this neuroplastic and the solution of defenses and so on, of this experiential, I would say cathartic sessions. But the point is how that mind is changed on the long term. And my question is also, have you ever thought, or if you should make a protocol longer, if there is any improvement on results? My question is, why is these sessions only this?
Well, I'll kick off. Most of what we do is completely constrained by how much funding we've got from the people who want us to do it. So that escitalopram study was, I think, the first double dose of psilocybin in a clinical trial. That was 3 weeks apart. And a couple of other groups have done something similar since. But those trials are very, very expensive outside the range of academics like ourselves. The COMPASS trial, which is, I briefly showed you the COMPASS study in the 3 doses in multiple countries. They're moving on to a phase 3 trial where they will allow people who relapse, I think within 3 or 6 months, to have another dose. And I think the model of topping up intermittently for those people who respond but then relapse, I think that's a model that's being developed. We're seeing it in some of the clinics like Clinic of Change as well. People come back. So I think that might be quite a powerful way of maintaining wellness. But I should say, it's surprising how some people just that single dose does seem to produce this sea change in the way their mind works, and they stay well for a very long period. And the people in our experience that do well for a long time seem to be those whose problems were rather sort of unitary. So I'm thinking of a patient who had a very unpleasant divorce and was really struggling and was able to sort of deal with that. The ones where the relapse seems to come are those who've got problems which stem right back to childhood, and it's as if their brain is molded in a more negative way of viewing the world. And how we help those in the long term, I don't know, but it might be that repeated sessions, like repeated events with powerful, effective psychotherapy on top. In the end, you might be able to sort of keep them on a keel they want to be kept on.
Yeah, and no, I just agree with Dave. It's a lot about money. Which I'd love to try out different sessions and a number of sessions and over longer time. Even our little phase 3 has got £3 million, for the UK government. It's a lot of money. So yeah, there's that. I think that's why places like the Clinic of Change are so important, where we can collect real-world evidence about these kind of differences, and it's really, really valuable to see the data Victor presented. And I suppose to the point of how do you make these changes that happen within this relatively short therapeutic process long-lasting. I mean, we do, as Dave was saying, we've still got patients who are sober from our relatively brief intervention. I think there are things we can provide people with, so that's why we've introduced these kind of peer support groups, to try and extend the learnings and maintain them on a longer term outside of the relatively brief therapeutic process. But I mean, I have observed firsthand how transformative this can be for some people, not everyone. And again, it's something we want to find out more about, I guess, what predicts people to respond really well. Something we were talking about earlier, and I will shut up in a minute, was, and there's another study as well, actually. We got very overexcited. I know it's a really small number of people with the care intervention. But there's another study in a much larger, giving ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And it seems to work better in people with problematic substance use, which, as Dave was commenting, that's not normally the case. That normally makes therapies work less well. So there may be things like that about these interventions that will emerge with the Clinic of Change, in the next year, at next year's conference. I look forward to it.
Deal.
Yeah.
I'd like to say some words about the question of Dr. Mario. We are both psychiatrists and psychotherapists, and I think it's very interesting your question. What is the purpose of this treatment? And we can answer as a psychiatrist and as a psychotherapist. As a psychiatrist, I would say that most psychiatrists use this for reduction of symptomatology, and depression and the symptoms of anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder, etc. But this is a psychotherapy assisted with ketamine, and we want a more global change than just the reduction of symptomatology. And we want what I think all psychotherapists want, a global change of what we can call we would like to have a metanoia. It's a Greek word, comes from religion, but it's a global change and that allows people to feel better with themselves and with the world. And that's our purpose. But not everyone can get this only with our treatment, 1 month treatment. Most people do, but others need and want to continue his psychotherapeutic work with the psychotherapist, but they feel much more empowered by this treatment.
Which is a model we're considering. Well, no, we're starting. Again, for reasons of lack of funding, we are starting a study of psilocybin in gambling addicts. Now, the gambling addicts are in therapy. They're having a kind of mindfulness, problem-solving therapy at a gambling treatment center. And we're going to bring them in for a psilocybin session with their therapist. So, because we like to have 2 therapists or guides present during the trip. So it'll be one of ours, but their standard therapist. And then that therapist can then carry on the therapy, which has obviously failed, otherwise they wouldn't have come to us in the first place. so that's a model which may be helpful in different ways. It's economically helpful, but also may help therapists, because I mean it's pretty tough if you're not really helping people, but and you think there's an opportunity that psychedelics might make it easier for them to engage with you. So think about that as well.
Very well. You have time for one more question? We'll have the last one, if you don't mind.
Só felicitar, de facto, a Clínica Change pela excelente conferência que promoveu aqui e os seus convidados. E para quem tem anos de trabalho psiquiátrico com fármacos, é de facto uma nova era que se abre aqui, porque deixa muitas questões em aberto. Muitas. Porque é que a melhora é tão rápida? Porque é que o efeito é tão rápido? Porque é que se mantém esse efeito durante tanto tempo, não é? Mesmo sem o fármaco, não é? E muitas vezes sem psicoterapia também. Quando nós demoramos anos de psicoterapia e anos a promover uma mudança no paciente e muitas vezes não conseguimos. Era apenas este comentário e parabéns à clínica.
Obrigado. It was a comment just to thank you all for being here and saying that we are facing challenging times. And he's a psychiatrist, doesn't look for a long time. And see this as a lot of changes coming and also a lot of questions coming that are not answered, but seems to be very, very demanding in the way they are changing the life of a lot of patients. And of course that we need more research and more work on that, but thank you for your support and for your question. So now a final remark for each one of you, just a small key takeaway, so everyone can go to our homes and places with something from this event. So I will start from right to the left. Vitor, what is the most important key takeaway that you would like that all of us will take home after this session?
First of all, to thank your presence. It's the most important thing here, to thank your interest in this area. I see a lot of known faces. And I know that sometimes I talk about these themes in my classes, and people know I'm enthusiastic of this, and to thank that and to say that we are opening promising ways of helping people, and the other will come. I hope that we follow the example of Australia. We are ready to use also psilocybin and MDMA. Perhaps the influence of Professor David Nutt was key to this his visit to Australia. I think it was very important to this opening of Australia. In Europe, we still don't have that, but I'm hoping that so that we can help more people that are not helped even with the ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, and to thank our visitors, which we always learn a lot with people that are ahead of their own time, and thank you very much.
Celia, a key takeaway for everyone?
Yeah, I guess my key takeaway is a sense of optimism, which is great. To have these therapies running here in Lisbon, and to see the expertise within the team, within the Clinic of Change, I think is extraordinary. You know, just the psychotherapeutic skills above what we are doing. I think it's a really unique and really extraordinary team. So I'm really excited to learn what will come from that, because I guess from what I was saying, I think just using these medicines and with ketamine, but also MDMA, psilocybin, as drugs on their own without the psychotherapeutic container is really missing a trick and missing an opportunity to get the most out of these therapeutic opportunities. So yeah, excited, very pleased that it's the Clinic of Change delivering this. Yeah. So.
David?
Yeah, I would just say, well, you're very lucky, because almost all of you, apart from one man in the back, is younger than me. And that's her dad. You're going to see this field turn into a major branch of psychiatry and medicine over the next 30 years. Well, I hope you will, but I can say it's if it doesn't, it's not my fault. Right? I've given you enough initiative to get going.
Professor António José Santos, se quiser aproveitar também.
Well, I do believe that this is one of the first steps towards revolution in psychiatric nosology and psychological theory that we really need more and more. Of course, we work with tools, and as we all learn, internalization, perturbation, externalization, and those classifications, whatever the classifications, help us, to classify phenomena. But we are far from understanding the process, and this is really a first step in understanding processes more and more. And I believe that it is this interplay, precisely, of neuroplasticity and subjective experience, so a totally material reality and a totally virtual reality that probably may help us to better understand mental health. Thank you.
Muito bem. Acho que merecem um aplauso antes de encerrar. E agora só ia dizer-vos uma pequena nota para vos agradecer, encerrar este evento. Nunca tinha feito locutor de uma sessão, gostei imenso, vou passar a fazer mais vezes. Queria-vos dizer que cumprimos o nosso objetivo principal graças à participação de todos. Obrigado pela vossa presença, os que estiveram aqui, os que assistiram à distância. Em especial aos nossos oradores, António Vaz Carneiro, David Nutt, C.D. Morgan, Vítor Amorim Rodrigues e António José Santos. Aos participantes, obrigado mais uma vez. A nossa equipe original, já vou agradecer à nova equipa, mas a nossa equipa original que fez parte e acompanhou estes casos clínicos. O Vítor, a Carla, Marisa, Joana Bastos e Silva, o Nuno Torres, o Guilherme Bastos Martins e a Magda Carvalho, e também à Suzete, que apoiou na área da investigação. Um agradecimento muito especial aos nossos estudantes, porque eles são a razão e são o principal propósito do nosso projeto. E se não fossem eles, e se muitas vezes não tivessem sido os testemunhos deles, nós não teríamos sido capazes de chegar a outros doentes. E, portanto, eu queria agradecer muito a todos, e em particular àqueles que tiveram a coragem de dar a cara em relação em relação a todos até esta situação que é inovadora e bastante acreditamos nós que é importante na área da saúde mental. À PLMJ também queria agradecer, à Pinguim, que se associou connosco e aconselhamos a todos, para saberem mais, a comprarem o livro, à nossa equipa operacional, coordenada pela Maria João Lopes e pela Joana Pimenta, e passou um ano, como vimos, muito foi feito e estamos orgulhosos do caminho percorrido. A da Clinic of Change é hoje um projeto ainda mais sólido e robusto do que no seu início. Somos uma clínica de saúde mental com uma visão holística, multidisciplinar, que quer continuar a primar pela inovação, excelência clínica e pela produção científica. Integramos recentemente a esketamina na nossa prática clínica, estabelecemos parcerias com seguradores e alargámos o nosso corpo clínico. A Ana Teresa Prata, a Lara Pessoa Nunes, o Rui Sintra, o Lúcio Silva e a Simone Graça, a nossa estagiária, fazem agora parte da nossa família e estamos muito contentes por terem se juntado neste nosso caminho. Queremos chegar a mais pessoas porque o que fazemos, como vimos, pode mesmo fazer a diferença na sua vida. Continuamos a querer ser inclusivos e a contribuir para a saúde mental em Portugal. A nossa presença com os 5 casos clínicos do Congresso Nacional de Psiquiatria é também um contributo para o debate sobre aquilo que fazemos com total transparência. Para nós é importante demonstrar o que correu bem e também o que não corre tão bem, porque só assim é que podemos aprender e aprender com os outros profissionais de saúde mental que existem no nosso país. E a verdade é que nós não pretendemos mudar o mundo, mas também não gostamos que tudo fique na mesma. O sonho que uniu 2 transmontanos, o Abílio Martins e a Carla Maris, e um beirão, ainda continua vivo, sobreviveu ao primeiro ano e acredito que sobreviverá também ao segundo. Gostaria de anunciar em primeira mão também que iremos ainda este ano constituir a nossa Comissão de Ética para reforçar o nosso projeto também na sua componente científica e que será liderado pela professora Ana Sofia Carvalho, que é uma pessoa conhecida na área da ética no nosso país. Portanto, um bem-aja a todos e um regresso seguro a casa. Obrigado.